I want to welcome you all here tonight. My name is Steve Zeltzer, and I'm a producer of Work Week, which is a program on KPOO in San Francisco. And also I'm a producer in Pacifica on a show called Capitalism, Race, and Democracy, which is on the Pacifica Network. And I'm also a supporter of a group called United Front Committee for a Labor Party. So one of the things I've done in many decades is covering working people and their struggles on the job, what conditions they face, and their fight for justice, their fight for human rights, their fight for health and safety. And even if you have a union, doesn't mean you're protected. And because the problem is that the corruption of the government, corporate takeover of agencies is endemic. It's happening all over in this country, and that's why people are angry. They're not getting support. They're not getting protection. And as a result of that, not only are workers being threatened, people are contaminated. And I partly grew up in San Jose and lived in Almaden. In fact, I grew up near the Almaden mine there, which was one of the first multinational in California. And it was a mine to get cinnabar out of the mines. And it used to come down the creeks, and I used to collect the mercury. I didn't know it was dangerous. We have independent media in this country, and that is under a threat. And as everyone knows, Larry Ellison, who's a techno-fascist, is taking over CBS. He wants to take over CNN, and it's harder and harder to get information out that hasn't been censored and controlled, because these individual cases that are going on around the country are connected. They may seem isolated, but they're not. And the media really don't want to talk about the connections because so many working people are affected, so many corporations are affected. So in any event, I've been covering a lot of injured workers who have been injured on the job and fighting for justice, fighting for health care. And I expose the fact that the workers' comp system is completely corrupt. It's controlled by the insurance companies and employers. They commit fraud, including Elon Musk at Tesla, who actually set up a company for health care for the workers that prevented workers from going to a hospital when they're injured. So they wouldn't have to record that they'd been injured. And basically, it is a felony workers' comp fraud. He was getting away with that. He was never prosecuted and held accountable. But injured workers are held accountable. So one of the things that has happened is many of the people that I've covered have been able to be, not many, but some have been successful, like Becky McLean, who was a molecular biologist at Pfizer. And I think that shows that you can fight back. And one of the things that we have learned is that people have to come together and collectively fight. We can't fight individually. By coming together collectively, we have power. So that's one of the reasons this movement for workers' rights, for human rights, has to involve people from all over. And in San Jose, I remember when in San Jose computers were coming in, and we were told computers are a clean industry. You know, you wouldn't have to worry about toxins like an iron mill, and it was going to be clean, it was going to be safe, and also computers would free you. You know, it would do the menial work for people. So that's how the propaganda, and as we all know, number one, it's not a clean industry. In fact, IBM in South San Jose was putting toxics in the ground. There was an epidemic of cancer. And Larry Rose, who was a former director of Cal-OSHA medical unit, tried to get the records. They wouldn't give him the records because they said they had an arrangement with Cal-OSHA, voluntary records. So they couldn't get a record of a cancer outbreak at that IBM lab. So another person that I came across as a result of the San Francisco Bayview was our speaker tonight, Ashley Gjovik. And because she also was involved in exposing, Hunters Point Shipyard, and which is another one, Treasure Island, which were nuclear radioactive weapon sites, where they were bringing contaminated ships and sandblasting them, spreading the toxins, the contaminated material into the ocean, and you had a laboratory for animals testing radioactivity, and the workers were being tested and given radioactive material to see how they reacted. So that's another story, and that's still going on because the workers in the community got sick. The whistleblowers were fired, including under the former vice president, who was attorney general in California, She covered that up, or Sarah covered it up. I mean, these officials, attorney generals and officials, are supposed to be protecting us and prosecuting, and they don't. Our speaker tonight is Ashley Gjovik. She is a tremendous woman that has taken up the fight against Apple and used her skills, and she has tremendous skills that she had at Apple because she was an engineering manager. She's used those skills to defend herself and to defend other people in the community. And this struggle is ongoing, but it's gotten further than any other struggle at Apple, and it's really an historic struggle. So welcome, Ashley Gjovik.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm so excited to be here. I'm actually originally from rural Oregon, but I lived in Portland, Oregon growing up, and I didn't realize we had an anti-war group here in this facility, and it feels like home. I'm so excited to be here and be able to speak here. Thank you. And I want to talk about what happened with me working at Apple. I worked at Apple Corporate. I was a senior engineering program manager. It's big tech. And the retaliation story is very similar to stuff you'll hear across the U.S., across internationally. Retaliation's generally the same, playbook. It's the same checklist. But the origin of my battle with Apple is hyper-local. And so I'm also really glad to be here and in San Jose, where all of these issues really emerged in the 70s and 80s when we realized just how filthy this computer manufacturing is. And the communities were lied to about it. So my whistleblower disclosures, the primary ones, all are about hazardous waste exposure, hazardous waste dumping, communities getting sick, workers getting sick. And what I didn't know when I first started making those disclosures was the history of this area. I moved to Santa Clara County in 2015, so I hadn't been here a long time, and I was mostly in my bubble with other big tech workers, so I didn't know the history. And it was only when I started reaching out to people, when I was finding stuff, asking questions, was I educated and immediately brought into the folks advocating about Treasure Island and Hunters Point, and I was able to help support them. And generally every story I heard was worse than I ever imagined. So it was incredibly validating of what I was seeing was concerning, was a problem, but it was the tip of the iceberg. And it's been going on for decades. And it's all systemic, and everyone's going to cover it up, and it's going to be a fight forever. And we've lost a lot of the community organizing here. So I met the folks who were doing that organizing in the 80s and 90s, who got Superfund enacted, got Santa Clara County to have the most cleanup sites in the whole nation. But a lot of that really fizzled out after they offshored the industry and took it away from this area and were union busting. There was a lot of tech companies starting to try to unionize in the 90s in this area. And then they broke all of that up and moved all the facilities away to other countries. And then now we look at these tech companies here, and it's fascism. It's entirely fascism. You have strict NDAs, they're living in their own little bubbles, it's extremely exploitive, they're not giving anything back to their communities generally, and there's very little community organizing, let alone labor organizing. So I'm really excited to be here and talk about this whole story and try to bring it home, because I think we need more than anything is to bring all of that back, especially now that they're trying to do these dangerous industries and manufacturing here again. So like the CHIPS Act, where they're talking about doing semiconductor manufacturing here again, and fabrication. They want to bring it back to the US. There's been federal funding coming in the last few years. The California government has been loosening restrictions, ongoing. Like every month there's a new law that they say don't apply now. That's environmental health and safety. Yeah, and so not only are they bringing back the stuff that we had community outrage about because of the cancer clusters, because of contamination of groundwater and soil that would take hundreds of years to clean up some of the worst sites, they can make more of those again. People could be exposed at work, and the city, county, and federal government are generally just loosening all restrictions to have them do it even faster, with very little red tape. And we're just going to recreate the same issues that we saw in San Jose in the 1980s, where there's cancer clusters, birth defects, absolutely devastating environmental contamination, huge Superfund sites that went miles. And so that takes me, how did my story start? It was a semiconductor manufacturing plant operated by my employer without any disclosures. That's what they were doing, in a very dense residential area directly across the street from massive apartment building, city parks, a children's playground. And they were just dumping all their pollution into the air. This is Santa Clara City. This is right across the street from Santa Clara Square Apartments, where they put in 1,800 units, so over 4,000 people, 3 city parks, a children's playground directly across the street from their fab. And these chip fabs are how we got a ton of these Superfund sites. And they have really dangerous toxic gases that can kill people within minutes if there's a leak. They're supposed to be really far away because they're so dangerous. It's ultra hazardous. And Apple put in a facility without labeling it as Apple, without labeling it as anything industrial, directly across the street from all this stuff. Self-reported dumping at least 8 tons of hazardous waste into the air every year, just directly across from these apartments. I got sick there in 2020 from some kind of unknown chemical exposure. And I spent years trying to figure out what it was. I wrote an article in San Francisco Bayview, realized, because it was also on a Superfund site of old contamination, but all the government agencies said it wasn't enough contamination to explain the symptoms. So I went through the whole bureaucracy of trying to figure out where am I getting poisoned from, and all the agencies like giving up and not wanting to look. Wrote an article about it, and that's how I started organizing with Treasure Island folks. And then the next year, in 2021, I had a dispute with Apple because my office is also on one of these federally overseen toxic waste cleanup sites. Superfund sites, they call them. And mine's the triple site in Sunnyvale, because there's 3 of the sites on a mega plume. So when they spill all their solvents and contamination to the ground, there's like aquifers in the ground. And when the contamination goes in, all that water in the ground gets full of that, those solvents, those chemical pollutions, and it can travel miles. And as it's there, it evaporates and pushes up. So at the very least, it's going to the exterior air where people are walking around on a sidewalk or on a park. But if there's a building over it, it pushes up into the building, into indoor air. It's called vapor intrusion. And it's a huge issue in Santa Clara County because there's so many of these sites, whether they're federally overseen or more local, because there's a lot of mitigation that has to be in place to make sure people aren't exposed to that stuff. Like the number one is you need it seems pretty dumb, but like putting a solid concrete floor is the number one. Like that just seems like they do something more advanced at this point, but literally that's like the number one. Just make sure it's fully sealed because then the stuff can't come up into the air. And then there's some other stuff they'll do with like venting and that sort of stuff. And there were a bunch of cracks in my floor of my office. And I had just learned how this stuff worked because of all my investigating about my apartment and trying to figure out what was going on there. And so Apple and I got in a pretty heated dispute about the cracks in my floor at my office building. And that's how I got fired and my life ruined, and I'm bankrupt and I'm homeless now, and I've been fighting them in court for years and years and years. And so it all kind of starts with that hyper-local of some of the hazards we have here, the history we have here, the agencies that are already so captured on these topics because industry's been beating them about it into submission for decades because they know exactly how this plays out. And if they're going to start bringing this stuff back to Santa Clara County, those agencies know this stuff we're going to have a lot more of this again. There was a lot of lawsuits. One of them, most famous, was against Lockheed Martin in the 90s and early 2000s. It's called Skunk Works case, where Lockheed Martin had a bunch of employees working in a military site. They said everything was confidential, including all the chemicals they were using, and that the employees didn't have a right to know what they were exposed to because the chemicals were secret because of national security. Those employees ended up getting hundreds of millions of dollars. In a court verdict, and then they were appealing it and fighting it for a really long time. But this story is like old as time here. And so when I realized that, I also realized why it seemed like the agencies were like extra reluctant to do anything they're supposed to do. They're like, we're not touching that. That's Apple, and that's semiconductor fab, and that's toxic waste, and the whole list. And that's been so informative to me through that whole process of the risks that everyone faces with that and how dangerous it is. Because that stuff, you could be exposed to it and lose years off your life. The stuff is carcinogenic, like TCE at these sites, TCE, PC. That stuff, it's proven to give cancer. It's on like the Prop 65 list for California. And yet they know people will be exposed to at least a little bit of it at these sites. The EPA and the state agencies will give a limit of how much is acceptable, even though they know that any could cause cancer. And so like when you're trying to advocate even about this of like, I shouldn't be exposed to this, we shouldn't be exposed, we should be, at least warned and have a choice about whether we're going to be there or not, they'll rely on these agencies saying, well, they decided that at least a little bit of it is okay, a little bit of cancer risk is okay, and then claim everything's secret. So I want to talk through a little bit what happened with Apple, which goes to the more typical checklist of the retaliation, but just really bring it home of no matter what the company is here, even these like flashy tech companies that seem more modern, like an Apple or Google, it's the same retaliation checklist, and it's this very local, long-running battle with workers and communities about environmental health. Because this area is always, since at least the 50s and 60s, there's been a lot of manufacturing that they were doing microwave stuff, they were doing Department of Defense contracting, they're building lots of development of these chips, and it was the same massive amount of gases and solvents and toxic stuff, creating messes for the community that they're dealing with for decades and decades or longer, and then the workers being exposed. The history also with the workers is generally it's going to be non-white and non-male. Generally, non-white, non-male workers are the ones that were assigned where there's the highest risk of exposure in cancer and disease. So it was always off-sourced to the most marginalized folks who generally would not be listened to the most, would have the hardest chance of advocating for themselves, the most limited resources. And that also brought it into perspective for me, especially with Treasure Island and Hunters Point. It's a racial justice issue too. And so I kind of felt like it was part of my responsibility as someone that did have privilege for a bit. I'm homeless now. And who probably could get a better chance of getting people to listen to me, that I should talk about this as much as I can. Because there's people dying right now in Treasure Island, and I've talked to them. There's people with cancer. They have radioactive radiation poisoning.
Isotopes.
I won't disclose her name. I don't know if she's still talking publicly, but she was interviewed in that article. This woman, she was in her early 20s, and she still had radiation poisoning in her bones. She didn't know that she was exposed when she was there. She got really, really sick, and eventually found out that like her favorite place to go sit by San Francisco Bay was on top of they found like a plutonium cluster under the rock. And they found them, it was in her bones still. So it'd take like a decade to get out of the bones. So, I think everyone just needs to be very suspicious of all the government agencies and all the businesses with this stuff, and do your research about what's going on in those areas. And if there's contamination, ask lots of questions, be really noisy and push back. But I want to tell you about what happens inside the companies too, because we do have to have each other's backs. These companies will try to alienate and isolate workers. They'll try to defame them and cover up what happens with their cases. But especially these environmental health and safety whistleblowers, like my story, each of these stories represents community health, worker organizing, general right to know what's going on in these areas. And I think it's something we should all care about, regardless of the company or the workers. And then at these jobs, we need to like not restart from scratch, but go back and relearn that history of where we left off in the 90s in this area, where they were finally starting to unionize. They're starting to get like some of the big unions were actually doing organizing and talking about this exposure and informing workers about chemicals and their rights and how to protest and pushing on the businesses to be more responsible. We had local laws, like the Santa Clara County Toxic Gas Ordinance was passed. It ended up becoming International Fire Code. It was deployed internationally, and it was about these really toxic gases at these chip fabs. So I'm hoping we can re-educate everyone and be like, let's start where we left off. We don't have to start from scratch, but we need to start now, especially if they're bringing all this stuff back. Because it's going to be too late, even in a few years, if they're already doing all this stuff, poisoning communities, creating more contamination sites. So my story started in 2020. I had been working at Apple for 5 years already. I started in 2015. And it was when I got really sick at this apartment complex. I had moved into these luxury apartments. I was going to law school part-time while I was working. I wanted to go and at least do like volunteer work in some kind of human rights law. I was not satisfied working in tech. And I wanted to be closer to my law school. And the apartments were nice. They were just Santa Clara Square apartments built by Irvine Company, very bougie, very beautiful. You would never guess that you're being exposed to a ton of toxic waste. And it wasn't just Apple's chip fab. They built them on the federal oversight of a hazardous waste cleanup Superfund site. They built it on a Superfund site plume with TCE and PCE and vinyl chloride. There's also, we call them brownfield sites, where there's more local oversight of hazardous waste in the ground that they're cleaning up. There's some of those nearby too. And then Apple was operating the semiconductor manufacturing plant stealthily without disclosing it to anyone, which is a big no. Like, one of the things that was really fought hard was right to know for communities. It's EPCRA is the statute, and it's the community's right to know if there's going to be dangerous manufacturing happening near them. The very least, they need to be made aware that it's happening what chemicals are there, the safety sheets for those chemicals, because if they're being exposed and being sick, they're the ones that are going to be able to figure out, oh, it could be that chemical. That list says these symptoms could be happening. So then they alert the agencies and the company and say, hey, it looks like there's a leak. It looks like there's an issue. So of course the companies don't want anyone to know. They want you to have, oh, you have allergies all of a sudden. It's just allergies. It's anxiety. It's whatever. So they fought that, and it was never really rolled out, and it became less of an issue because it was really about semiconductor manufacturing, which got offshored, which got moved out of the country. But we're back. So there was no disclosures. I started suffering fainting spells, arrhythmia, rashes. My blood pressure was really high, really low, fluctuating all the time. I was having premature ventricular contractions, which feel like really extreme palpitations. And when I wore a heart monitor, it's when your heart starts trying to beat but out of the wrong chamber first. And I was having over 7% of my heartbeats were these premature ventricular contractions. They couldn't figure out why. It was coming out of nowhere. The rashes they couldn't figure out. My heart rate also slowed down. I'd been wearing my Apple Watch, so I had my heart rate data. I don't wear that anymore. I don't want them spying on me. And that was the one thing that really challenged the doctors, because of course doctors also wanted to be like, you have anxiety. You're just, working in school too much. It's just in your head. And especially being a woman coming in, it's very prone to getting that kind of response. And actually the slow heart rate was what really won them over. When I showed them, I was like, if it's anxiety, why isn't my heart rate slow? Shouldn't it be fast? And then they were like, that's true. Maybe it's not anxiety. So that was a huge help for me, actually. And all these symptoms I had been listing, and they were screening me for sudden onset MS, brain tumors, heart failure, all sorts of stuff. They couldn't figure it out. But when I eventually figured out that there was chemical exposure happening in my apartment, it was from blue air, air filters during the wildfire smoke. They had something that was monitoring for volatile organic compounds, which I didn't even know what that was. And it was spiking when I was the sickest. And I went and researched, I'm like, what is that? And it can be solvent. So I'm piecing it together, being like, there's some kind of chemical fumes in my apartment apparently when I'm the sickest. That's weird. That led to me seeing chemical exposure doctors in the area, and then being like, every single symptom you had for 7 months is just chemical exposure. All of that fits acute exposure to industrial chemicals. That was the only diagnosis that actually hit everything that had already been documented. So that started my journey, because then I'm like, well, something's wrong. And I'm on apparently 9 toxic waste cleanup sites. So there's some chemicals there. And it's in an area that used to be very heavily industrial, and so I was calling all these agencies, hey, something's going on. I was exposed to something. It seems really bad. Other people could be sick. And no one wanted to look hard. No one looked at anything. But Apple had also done a really good job covering their tracks. And so the only agency that really seemed to know what they were doing was City of Santa Clara, which I don't know how many of you are familiar with the city. And they were just helping them cover it all up. They kept it out of the environmental impact report for the apartments. They kept it out of any of the disclosures that would be needed. They didn't make them file the paperwork or get the permits. And they were notified. I reached out to them and told them, I'm sick. There's some kind of chemical exposure happening. It's at this location. What could it be? They're like, no idea. At the same time, they're doing the inspections of Apple's Fab, seeing all the stockpiles of massive amounts of chemicals.
Did you ask any people who were also other tenants in your lot?
Other people were sick.
What? Other people were sick?
Yeah.
Too?
So what I ended up, and I was in law school, so I was talking to some of my professors too, how do I navigate this? This is going to be dicey. And so what I decided to do was publish an article about my experience, just factually, talking about my experience of identifying that I was being exposed to stuff, talking to the agencies and getting nowhere. I had reached out to the mayor, met with her a couple times. She wasn't doing anything. No one was. So it was a frustrated article, just factually, of someone should be looking into this. It seems like something's terribly wrong. Here's all the evidence I have personally, and here's my dead ends with everyone that's supposed to be able to help. And then I also focused that on Treasure Island and Hunters Point, saying this is not the only location here locally. This is apparently a long-running issue of people getting sick with multiple sources, but people just dragging their feet and not wanting to investigate or gather any evidence that could inconvenience the agencies. It was published. It went viral. So this was a very surprising part of my story, is the fact that my employer was Apple, and I was talking about big tech stuff. Stuff got shared on those big tech messaging boards and forums. and a woman complaining about health issues, so they like to yell at me and say horrible stuff about me. But it made stuff go really viral, so I just accepted that at some point. I'm like, it's going to go viral as they're saying horrible stuff about me, but at least a lot of people are seeing the story. So I'll take it. And it got, I think she said, the editor said it was like 30,000 views within 2 weeks, which is really high for San Francisco Bayview. She said that was one of their highest viewed articles, which is really cool. I hopefully got a lot more traffic for their other articles too. But I quickly had a lot of other people reaching out to me with mystery illnesses, very similar symptoms as mine. Also could not figure out what was going on. A couple of them reached out to the government. Mayor sent emails. Nothing was done for them either. So that was really frustrating. And I felt responsibility on that too, of I was urging them to come forward and share their stories too, and then they're also just getting turned away. And the Irvine company is, I think, at this point, one of or the biggest developer in the United States now. They're very, very wealthy, billions of dollars. And this was their huge apartment complex they just built in their big center. It's $2 billion valuation of the whole thing. So of course they're just she's crazy. Her air's fine. Don't listen to her. They put that on Yelp. They were making fun of me on Yelp. It was so messed up. And I luckily at that point had found a couple allies, even within the government. California Department of Public Health had an environmental health group that I believe is now shut down. They stopped funding it. But they were still there at that time, and they were validating me and championing me to keep gathering evidence and trying to figure out what's happening. And even my chemical exposure doctors I saw, one was at Stanford and one was at UCSF, even in the visit notes were the government needs to look into this and find what their source is. I showed the government. They're like, no. I got lots of runaround of all the reasons they can't and won't investigate. And that was 2020, 2021. I was doing all that advocacy. Then I got distracted by all the Apple retaliation on my workplace. I didn't find out that Apple was running a semiconductor fab right across the street from where I got sick until 2023. Much later. And even when I saw that, I wanted to investigate more and make sure that really could be them and that could be the source. Felt confident, filed a lawsuit, and by that time, Apple got it dismissed on statute of limitations, arguing I should have figured out it was them running a chip fab that almost killed me in 2020 sooner and sued them sooner. So I lost my rights. I said, that's crazy. Because they were hiding what they were doing. So I'm suing them now in a separate lawsuit over the chip fab. It's an environmental citizen suit where I'm stepping into the DOJ's shoes, DOJ and EPA, to sue under the federal environmental statutes and arguing that the government is failing to diligently enforce their own laws. And there's a whole you give a notice and give the government time to act, and if they don't act, then you can sue, and they can try to argue the government is doing something, so it should be dismissed. But if they're not, then you get to step in and be the regulator. So I'm basically a private DOJ right now. And that lawsuit doesn't have any damages for me. There's no money I'd get out of it. It's not about me. It's about their active risk to the community. And I filed a motion for preliminary injunction about a week ago where I'm asking to have it shut down. And the court can do that in these suits. A court can order a facility to stop operating even before the end of the case if there's an imminent and substantial danger to the community, which I've argued there is under a number of theories, but especially all their lethal gases. One of the documentation I got from when I was sick, looking back in retrospect of the tests, especially ones that didn't make sense at the time, was that I was exposed to something called arsine gas in my bedroom. Arsine is a gas form of arsenic. It's a chemical weapon. It's regulated as a chemical weapon. These chip fabs use chemicals like this to make their chips, and they have a lot of them. And I was having one of the most strange symptoms I had in 2020. It was waking up at 3 a.m. every couple weeks, and I had symptoms of heart failure. So my left arm was cold and blue and tingly, and I woke up choking, gasping for air, and my blood pressure was really low, and my bradycardia was my heart rate was really slow, and that was showing up on all the monitors whenever this happened. And this was after I figured out that there was some kind of chemical exposure happening. And I was going anyways to the lab to do blood tests and urine tests the next day. I got my doctors. I'm very pushy. I was a project manager at big tech, so it was my job to push people to do stuff. So I pushed my doctors to give me a whole menu of screening of chemicals. Because when I talked to my law professors and people working this, they said the only way you have any chance at all is if you can document those chemicals in the space around you, in your body, and in whatever facility. And if you don't even know what facility it is yet, the least you can do is document them in your space and in your body. Because if you can't prove that, you're going nowhere in your lawsuit, if you ever have a lawsuit. And so at that time, I took that advice, and I was able, it was really expensive too. It's incredibly prohibitory, because it was over $1,000 for me to even get a basic like air testing. And mine was only like 2 hours when apparently it should have been 24 to 48 hours. And I used the wrong testing equipment. It wasn't like advanced enough to get everything. But I still caught a bunch of their chemicals, industrial chemicals that shouldn't have been in my house. And I caught some of the same stuff in my labs. The one that really surprised me, though, was that morning before I had one of those 3 a.m. spells. And the arsine gas will only show up in your blood, not your urine. And it'll only be there for a very, very short period of time, like hours. And it was in my blood and not my urine when I had my test at 8 in the morning. So I had arsine gas in my bedroom when I had the 3 a.m. choking spells, dying spells. And so I cited that as one of the reasons. I'm like, if they are already leaking lethal gases that are regulated as chemical weapons into mass density residential, and I can show that I had arsine gas exposure and there's not a lot of places arsine gas comes from. You know, that's not like a lot of this stuff. They'll be like, well, toluene is like all over the place. Who knows? But I'm like, arsine gas, and they're like, yeah, that came from a chip fab. So I'm hoping the court will agree and at least partially restrict them from having the lethal gases on site and move off the really dangerous chemicals. Could also just shut down all industrial activity in that location. Long answer to your question. Yes, sorry.
So there is an actual chip fabrication plant right there with people working in it, or is everything automated?
No. Oh, we got so many questions. Okay.
You had a press conference there, right?
I did. We had it outside. It's an actual chip fab. So chip fabs are different sizes depending on what they're doing. When you have the like mass consumer ones where they're making it for like a huge product line like TMC or something, it'll be massive. They'll just be like 10 Costco's worth of a chip fab.
Wow.
But when they're, especially here, when they're doing stuff that's more targeted, like when they're doing DoD work and stuff, building for satellites or whatever, it's the same steps, it's the same chemicals, it's just smaller because they're not doing a mass production, but it's still the same dangers. And that makes it more risky here because it's easier to hide. They look just like an office building.
I worked in a place in the 80s where women,
Yeah.
stuffing chips into boards. And that's what I think of it. Were there people working there?
Yeah, in the bunny suits. They've said between 100 and 200 people, and it was operating, this is one of the worst parts of it, 24/7, but only Monday through Friday. They apparently just abandoned it on weekends, and no one was checking in on all of their hazardous waste and chemicals. They just left it, mostly for the weekends. But other than that, it was fully packed, and they were doing some of the assembly stuff too. Yeah. I hope you're okay from whatever that was.
You can talk about Apple company and government connections and the whole...
Yeah. So all that happens, and then I'm like so revved up, even before knowing it was Apple or a chip fab, just learning all the history and learning all this stuff, realizing how dangerous it is. And even from the old fabs, the people are still dying on these Superfund sites, on these groundwater plumes, because the EPA is just asleep purposefully. Like, they don't want to have to warn everyone they're going to get exposed, because then people ask a ton of questions, and EPA has to do more work, and then property values go down, and everyone gets mad, and it's a whole dance. So I'm like learning all about this and feeling really like, I want to organize people. And then I find out that my Superfund site office, Apple sends a notice that they're going to do some kind of inspection to check if there's like cracks in the floor, if there could be vapor intrusion. And I'm like, had you not been doing that? It sounds like this is the first time. And they had moved in like 2015. And when I looked at the history, it had been like a gutted, vacant building for like a decade prior. And it's on top of that triple Superfund site. And when I started trying to ask Apple questions about it, just like immediate retaliation, just like immediate. They opened like investigations into complaints I didn't make about my bosses to make my bosses mad about unrelated stuff. They said they won't answer any of my basic safety questions. My boss and like employee relations told me not to talk to my coworkers about my safety concerns, not to tell anyone it's a Superfund site, not tell anyone there could be exposure. Apple made it clear they really prefer I didn't talk to the government about my concerns. I just work with them directly. And then I'm like reporting immediate retaliation, that retaliation, so it's just a whole cascade. And I'm sitting there kind of being like, what did I just, what did I just unleash? And why are they being so wild? And who are my stakeholders? And who can I escalate to? And that's when I realized also a prior head of the EPA works at Apple. And they're acting like this. So that's Lisa Jackson. Lisa Jackson ran the EPA for a bit under Obama. And she runs Apple's government affairs and lobbying group now. And that kind of, like, to see how crazy Apple is acting, and that they even put employees on an office like this on top of such exposure just to save a buck, I was immediately getting suspicious. But then, you know, what I found from like FOIA requests and stuff was Lisa was actively meddling. Like, she was trying to hand select who would be running the EPA local office overseeing investigations into Apple. She was sending letters of recommendation from her Apple email account to the head of the EPA. And then my disclosures about what was going on at the office, because they found cracks, they're going to want to cover them up, didn't want to tell EPA. And I was like, you have to tell EPA. From what I'd seen, you have to go tell them there's an issue and you're going to fix it, but here's your plan. And then EPA has their experts come in and make sure you're doing it right and you gather enough data, because it's federally regulated. Like, if you're doing anything with that regulation, you have to tell them. And they were like, no, we're not going to tell them, we're not going to tell them. And then the EPA was like immediately telling me there's no issues without any data. That was also the thing where I'm like, do you still work for Lisa? Do you know, like, your old boss? And it was their old boss. I looked at some of these people. They used to work for her. And they're at the EPA, and the discovery records and FOIA showed that they were contacting Apple, immediately telling them they had an employee, Apple had an employee contacting EPA. They wanted Apple there to give the response with the EPA, to not talk to me directly, and was reassuring Apple there was no issues at the office they hadn't even been to and had been ignoring. And I was just, so like, this whole story becomes government capture and corruption and cover-ups and moral injury and institutional betrayal. And Apple gave me like a really strong dose because it's Apple, you know, very powerful company and has a lot of connected people as executives and partners. So that one was a trip. That was a trip. But eventually I gave EPA enough information, they realized they had to pay attention. Because I was like, they said there's a bunch of cracks in the floor, and they're going to cover them up and not tell anyone and not test beforehand, was apparently enough. And then EPA started looking at some of the documents they should have been looking at for years, and realized that when Apple moved in, okay, so there's this thing, when you have the toxic waste vapors under the floor, you're supposed to have like a concrete floor, and then they'll have like a system where those vapors can go into a venting system, and they'll try to vent them to the roof so they don't just come into like the interior space. Call them like sub-slab depressurization systems. There's a variety of names. Apparently when Apple moved in, they moved stuff on the roof, so where all the toxic vapors were going to the roof to get like exhausted, one, it wasn't being like cleaned at all. They're supposed to have like a charcoal or some kind of cleaner so you're not just polluting the air, but they were just polluting the air. But they moved it so the HVAC intake was really close to where the exhaust was of the toxic vapors. It's called re-entrainment. A very basic concept in mechanical engineering, come to find out, that Apple just skipped over. And so they had the toxic gases coming out and then into the HVAC intake to our office. And EPA caught that within like just a quick review of stuff. They're like, oh, we got to go check that out. But they did that in 2015, and it wasn't until 2021 that EPA even looked at the paperwork. So we were exposed to all that stuff for years. So they finally go, they do an inspection. But as soon as they tell Apple they're going to go do an inspection, Apple puts me on administrative leave and removes me from the workplace and all workplace interactions, and is doing fake investigations into me and, you know, trying to get me to quit and harassing me a bunch. And Apple successfully hid that there was even an EPA inspection until I got EPA to admit it like a year later. So I was fired right after this EPA inspection where they found a bunch of issues that was due to my complaints, and Apple was able to hide that there was even an inspection at all. And EPA helped them cover it up. So that's not great. When all this stuff started happening with Apple, I really questioned my role working for them. Because I was pretty high up, but I was helping them do all their corporate colonial stuff and consumer, you know, polluting the environment and selling people stuff they don't need and all this stuff. And I'm looking back on my role working for them and realizing that they're evil. Like the legal teams, the HR teams are just very, very naughty. The stuff they were doing was immediate overt retaliation. It was like, I could tell, I was like, you're like trying to frame me for stuff I didn't do. So their number one thing was like trying to create investigations into complaints I didn't even make that they knew would really upset my supervisors. And I said that. I'm like, it seems like you're just choosing stuff that's going to really upset my supervisors. I don't want you to do that. It's going to make them mad. I just want you to tell them that they can't tell me I can't talk about workplace safety. That was my one request. I'm like, my boss keeps telling me I can't talk to my coworkers about workplace safety concerns. I'm fairly certain the law says I can do that. So like, can you explain labor laws? He doesn't understand them. And that's how I got a bunch of like sexism and sexual harassment investigations into a bunch of male supervisors and executives that of course they found no issues, but told them all I was complaining about them and everyone got mad at me. And then my workload gets quadrupled and I get put on projects that everyone's gonna get mad at me and I'm gonna get fired for, I can see that all in the works. And they're skipping my mid-year review for some reason and won't tell me why. I see a lot of funny business going on. I'm like, you guys are getting ready to fire me. This sucks, you guys. What the heck? Because I had also been really high up, and I'd help them, like, solve problems and investigate issues. And I had this, like, false idea that I was somehow valuable to them, and they would be loyal to me like I had been loyal to them. And that was extinguished, like, within a minute, Where I'm like, you're doing me so dirty right now. I can watch it happening. You're going to, like, fire. You're going to ruin everything. And so then I got really, really mad at them. When they basically confirmed that's what they're doing, and I put my foot down and went on Twitter and started like complaining about Apple very publicly and filing government complaints and calling them out and writing like a big like issue confirmation of all this stuff. I was like, you need to investigate yourselves because you did all this bad stuff, you broke all these, and I went back to like, it was a very hostile work environment since the time I started at Apple too. Like it was a mess, but they pay a lot of money and I'd fallen into the whole big tech culture, so I put up with it. But I had a long list of very egregious wrongdoings. So I was like, I'm documenting it all. You should investigate all this stuff. Here's all the witnesses. Here's all the evidence. I took screenshots. Have fun. And then I'm going into like their cover-ups and them breaking all the labor laws and all the environmental issues. And then my big thing was like, your employee relations team apparently is just like an employee retaliations team. That's what I started calling them on Twitter. The employee retaliations team just comes in and retaliates against the employees to cover up any kind of complaints they're making. What is that, Apple? And I was complaining to them, too, that it's so hypocritical, because Apple likes to hold itself out as a very ethical company, very labor conscious, very environmental conscious. And I found out that, because I was already like, I want to talk to the manager of the employee relations team. This is ridiculous. His name is Tony. So I'm like, Tony, what is this? It seems like you guys are just retaliating and covering everything up. Tony, I also looked him up on LinkedIn before he started managing Apple's corporate employee relations. He did labor relations for Apple in Beijing. So in that first conversation, I'm like, Tony, can I ask you a question? Were you there setting up the suicide nets? It looks like it. So if you're not familiar, Apple had some controversies at their Foxconn factories in China because workers were killing themselves a lot. They'd rather die than keep working for Apple and felt like they had no other options. Apple's also done some stuff that's borderline like trafficking with visas and stuff. And Apple's response was just setting up suicide nets. So if they jump out the window, they catch a net and bounce instead of die. So then they can just be put back on the iPhone line. And so there was a bunch of bad press around that around like 2011, 2012, 2013. And that's when Tony was doing labor relations in Beijing. And he's like, his response was, he was like, it wasn't me, it was a vendor that set up the suicide nets. And that moment, that was early July 2021. They fired me September 9th, 2021. That moment with Tony where I realized it's a suicide nets guy made me realize there was no chance whatsoever Apple was going to do the right thing with my complaints. Like, he set up the nets so people can't die, so they can just force them back onto the iPhone lines. He doesn't care about my Superfund site office, And that's when I was like, okay, so you guys are going to fire me. I guess I'm going to sue you. I guess Apple and I are just in a legal fight now, and I want you to have to investigate all the wrongdoing. And like, I wanted the dog where you put its nose in the poop. I'm like, I want you to have to look at all the stuff you did to me for all these years. And I know, we both know you're not going to do the right thing, but I want you to have to at least pretend that you are. And maybe you'll learn something through this process. They ended up putting me on administrative leave and then abruptly firing me. And we're still in a legal battle about all of it. And I have gotten a lot of legal victories and agency victories with Apple, which is there's no chance on earth because they win everything. They have such huge high-powered defense firms and they have so many connections. But I'm really annoying. That was my job, was to be extremely annoying and not give up on anything. When they had a project, they had to make sure, a 1 or 2 year long project that no one wanted to do, but it had to happen. I was the kind of person they put on to make sure it happened. Once I was assigned, they're like, it'll happen because Ashley's on it. So I just, like Steve said, I just repurposed all those skills. with the agencies and Apple and all of that. So my experience with the agencies is stereotypical of what you'll hear from whistleblowers of these government agencies, California and federal, was just them like retaliating against me on behalf of the employer, refusing to investigate, refusing to follow any of their own processes, fabricating stuff, delays that last forever, where basically it's like a dismissal, but it's a delay because it's just years. It's just pointless. And then finding connections as I went through it. So like, I didn't actually ask for an EOC investigation. I just wanted the right to sue letter if I was going to sue, so I was going to get it. But I ended up connecting with other people who did have cases at the same time as mine. And they reported stuff I saw with like Department of Labor, OSHA, and my first NLRB investigator, where it was overt retaliation and obstruction and harassment. Like they tell you these stories, it's just wild. It's just trying to get the employee to give up and withdraw their claim. And what I found is like that's easiest for them because then they don't have to say they denied it. They don't have to provide a reason. No one's asking questions. Someone thinks maybe it was a settlement or something, who knows? And so that's what they want to push. They want to push to demoralize you, get you afraid, and get you to withdraw your claim and walk away. So that's all their behavior. And I saw them doing that. I was like, then I'm like, I want to talk to your managers. You know, that was the last first couple of years. And I never actually made it through with Department of Labor, OSHA. They're very... If you're not familiar with Daryl Whitman, please go watch Steve's videos where he interviews Daryl Whitman, who was a Department of Labor OSHA investigator in their whistleblower protection program. And he blew the whistle on them, retaliating against whistleblowers and obstructing cases, and then they fired him too. And it was actually the same region I was in. And I want to talk to your manager. I went up to their high, assistant director and was yelling, you guys are just covering this stuff up. You're not investigating. What is this? And I brought up Daryl Whitman, and he's like, oh, we fired all the people that were in charge then. We started fresh. And I'm like, but you were there. He's like, yep. And I'm like, you're still here? He's like, yep. And I'm like, and you're still doing it? So they're still doing it. So that case has been they waited years. They didn't actually investigate anything. They're stalling appeals. So if I filed 2021, and it's still just waiting for them to make a decision. And it's 2026. And I'm bankrupt. I'm in bankruptcy, Chapter 7 bankruptcy. I don't have permanent housing. I'm insolvent. This is what happens when they drag that stuff out. There's a real human cost, and they know it. They know most people at some point is going to be like, I'm just going to give up on this. I got to go, find something else to make this work. For me, it was my career working these type of companies. Everything that happened with Apple is very public. Once I took it to Twitter, it got covered in the press, and it was lots of articles, and I have a unique name. Gjovik's a unique name, so... And then Apple got a Wikipedia article written about me that mostly they just write. It says really horrible stuff. It's a sore subject. But you look up my name and that's what you find. So I could not get a job. And as soon as I made any progress trying to get a job, as soon as it went to the HR screening phase, there was no job. So then I'm like, this is the only option. I'm just going to keep fighting it. And I got my foot in the door so much with Apple that I might as well. When I started speaking out in 2021, I had a lot of other coworkers currently working at Apple and who had left, reaching out to me with horror stories that they also had just horrible experiences. Somehow it gets to HR and this employee relations team, and they're just retaliating. They're making it worse. A lot of them had stories of some version of forced to quit or fired, forced into some kind of settlement. But it was all very vague. And what I kept hearing is the experience with Apple is the worst thing in their life. Litigation was the worst thing in their entire life. They can't even talk about it. And they couldn't tell me why. And I finally think I'm figuring out what Apple's doing in litigation for that. But they're also just generally misusing NDAs to cover up all these workplace issues. So then we're like fish in a barrel when you're raising your issue oh, it's Apple, they'll investigate, but they've already retaliated against 400 other people with the same complaint and covered it up and gotten the NDAs. And so one of the things I was complaining about to Tony, Mr. Suicide Nuts, was that employees don't even know what's going to happen when they make the complaint because they don't know that it's such an adversarial situation, that this is just systemic, that all these issues, the same bad actors are doing the same bad stuff, the same stuff's getting covered up. And he ended up quitting, actually, shortly after all my stuff, and going back to school or something. I don't know, maybe he had a nervous breakdown after all this. I hope I gave him a little bit of a nervous breakdown. Because he even admitted to me, though, he's like, yeah, it would be harder, or it would be easier for my job if people actually knew how this worked. He told me. I documented that at the time. I was like, you're being honest. And And I told him too, like, I was complaining about the NDAs where they're trying to say they're false investigations or secret and confidential. And I was like, I'm in law school and I'm taking labor law and I learned about the NLRA and it says you can't claim my work conditions are confidential. That's illegal. And he said something about they don't like it when their employees figure out what labor laws are because it ruins their whole script. So like those Tony's nervous breakdown, maybe he was reflecting on his suicide nets. Maybe he was having a moment. With his honesty was helpful to me. All my coworkers, so many coworkers coming forward with the same horrible stories was really helpful to me. Hearing all the history of the environmental contamination and cover up was also, like all of this just kind of turned me into this like really stubborn, putting my foot down of like, there's no chance that I'm going to win against Apple. There still isn't, they win everything. They get everything dismissed immediately. And so like, it's like 0.0001% chance that I have like a victory at the end. And I'm still doing it. And I talked to lawyers at the start too, because lawyers want to take the case because it's Apple and they'll just, I say they're basically like rabid, like they have rabies, those lawyers in the court, because they're just so aggressive and they'd like to get the other side sanctioned for stuff. So they'll like set them up that they'll get them like in trouble in the court even. So it's like the same kind of games with retaliation, but they'll do it in court. So they'll make up things like they're breaking rules on discovery. They're breaking rules on this or that. Court, you should sanction them and get them in trouble. And they do, and they'll get them fined. Sometimes the plaintiffs will have to pay a bunch of money to the corporation for these false allegations in court. So lawyers are like, no return on investment with Apple. Unless you're going to settle right away, sign an NDA, we can help you get a settlement. And I don't know, I think fortunately for like the big picture, was in a state where I was like, I want people to have to know that this stuff is going on, that there's apparently this huge abyss of like all these people suffering, all these, like the community risk, the hazardous waste risk, all this stuff. And that Apple and probably a lot of other companies are really good at just covering all of this up and making it go away and no one would ever know. And so like, I want to push it. And lawyers told me that if I was to and I was like, I'll do it myself, I'll figure it out. I'm in law school. If I was to do it, it usually takes about 10 years for people. If you feel like you have a really strong case and you're willing to go through all the appeals and like see it through to the end, just a long and I was like, I'm a project manager, I do long projects. I think I can do that. So I'm like halfway through that and I'm actually ahead of schedule on my project plan. I was able to get an NLRB decision that Apple's employment policies and NDAs violate federal labor law, and Apple settled and withdrew a bunch of terms and updated a bunch of their policies nationally, including their definition of confidential information and all the policies they fired me under. That was huge. That was the very first national settlement Apple's ever had with NLRB. Thank you. Don't clap too much because apparently they didn't even tell my depositions. They didn't even tell the managers that this happened. They still think all the illegal policies are in place. Yeah, I know. Forwarded that to NLRB. I'm like, can you guys look into that, please? And then NLRB hasn't been too helpful about my complaints because Apple got their own defense attorney on my case to be the general counsel of the NLRB now. Crystal Carey, she was a defense attorney on Morgan Lewis, like all my own cases. She's now the general counsel of the NLRB, and as soon as she took over, they settled this, but are letting them just violate the settlement agreement. And then NLRB had sued Apple and filed a complaint saying this administrative leave and the termination were unlawful and violated the NLRA, and a bunch of stuff those employee relations investigators had said were violations too. Like that first one who was doing all the sexism investigations I didn't want. She gave me a 5-point balancing test to consider if I want to talk about workplace safety. It was like, does not make an assessment of workplace safety, does not cause concern, does not make people worried, maybe just consider not saying stuff. I can't remember what the list was. But everybody's like, that's illegal. You can't say that. Like, you can't put any caveats on employees talking about workplace safety. So they filed that. And then once Apple got their own lawyer in charge, they withdrew the complaint about the termination and administrative leave. But even with Apple's own lawyer, they had to keep all the other stuff. So I still have that case with the other, and I appealed. I'm trying to get the other stuff brought back, especially now that I'm getting more evidence. The EPA did do an inspection of my office before I was fired and did find issues, like made them fix the HVAC stuff where they basically turned my office into like a gas chamber, which is not preferable. You would think OSHA would be there though, but like OSHA is completely MIA, which is still really frustrating. So like my coworkers were definitely exposed to stuff, so was I, and I don't know how long they were exposed until Apple fixed it. And OSHA doesn't care, which makes me very mad. And then EPA took a formal enforcement action against Apple over the chip fab. Once I figured out Apple was operating that chip fab next to the apartments, and I had all those injuries myself, and I had evidence of other people reporting injuries too, I was able to get a US EPA RCRA, RCRA, is a hazardous waste management law, inspection, and they found a bunch of issues and wrote it up, and Apple ended up having to settle that and enter the very first EPA settlement agreement between Apple and EPA over hazardous waste violations. Yeah, that was really good. But they're still letting them operate it next to the parks and stuff. That was, it's still next to a playground with all the hazardous waste. So like every huge victory is still like, I'm like, that's not. And like they had to pay a fine, and it was like $200,000, I think was the fine. I'm like, that's like one web developer salary for a year at Apple. That's not going to stop them from doing any of this. So I'm still like celebrating all the victories, but like that's not enough. And then we just got a Bay Area air quality management settlement for that chip fab as well. I just got a copy of it this morning, and they're only fining Apple like $100,000 for polluting the air, for dumping all that stuff in the air next to all those homes and the kids' playgrounds and stuff. Just wild behavior. And then FOIA requests came back though, and the EPA did open a criminal investigation into Apple based on my complaint. That was really exciting. Yeah, thank you. So, criminal investigator was looking into the air pollution, and it was Bay Area Air Quality Management District was refusing to cooperate with the criminal investigator. The email showed them refusing to provide documents or talk to him. Just like, I see this stuff, and it's just really illuminating why we have all these issues and why you can be surprised so often in this area by something that's so hazardous and so dangerous and so unlawful. And you're like, why has no one done anything? You see all this stuff behind the scenes. Lisa Jackson sending letters of recommendation for her friend to run the, regional office of the EPA, or the air board obstructing the EPA's criminal investigation into air pollution. The NLRB being run by Apple's Defense Counsel. Oh, the EEOC. There's a question. I forgot. I filed an EEOC complaint. I had other coworkers who had EEOC cases at the time. The supervisor at the original EEOC at that time was applying to work at Apple and got a job at Apple on that employee retaliations team at that time. So I kept seeing all this stuff and just being like, there's no chance for workers. There's no chance for the community. We are in such a unequal position from the start, and no one even, I think, really knows until you're already too deep in it. So that's fueled my batteries with all of this ongoing, because it's such an injustice and it's so unfair. And it's the people getting hurt are the ones that generally don't even realize it. They don't know where it's coming from, or they have the least resources to advocate about it. And it just makes me so mad. And then I have a civil lawsuit, so I decided NLRB was taking forever, and they had their own funny business too. So I filed my own lawsuit in federal court for whistleblower stuff, and I had the claims about being exposed from the toxic waste in 2020. Apple was able to get my toxic waste claims dismissed, saying that I should have figured out sooner that it was Apple operating a chip fab and that they were the ones that almost killed me, and sued them sooner. And the court dismissed on that. That was a very demoralizing period in my life. I got extremely depressed. But I refiled it as an EPA citizen suit. So these are something that I think we need to learn a lot more about and have more people equipped, and really suggest NGOs pursue more. You give a notice to the EPA if you believe the federal environmental laws are being violated, it's a serious issue, and say, you guys do something, you actually act, or if not, I'm going to. And they have 60 days, and if they don't take a formal action, like in court, criminal or civil, then you can file in federal court and you can be a citizen DOJ and EPA. So that's what I filed. So I filed over that chip fab under Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, RCRA, the Right to Know Act, and the Toxic Substances Control Act. And I'm suing Apple, the property owner, and the city of Santa Clara. Because city of Santa Clara approved that chip fab being next to that huge development, concealed it in the environmental impact report for the development, ensured that no one knew that that chip fab was operating at the huge park where there's Whole Foods and yoga studios and parks and barbecues and stuff. And those are city parks. The city knows they have city parks directly across the street from this facility that's actively polluting and could cause a mass fatality event at any point, and has no warnings but invites children to come to its parks. So they're getting sued too. And I filed that last September, and I filed a motion for preliminary injunction about a week ago. And I'm asking the court to shut down the fab. Yeah. I'm arguing something called imminent and substantial endangerment, which is part of a statute of some of these. But then also California public nuisance, and just this is a danger to the community. There's no rational justification to accept this amount of danger and risk. That at any moment they could have one of these chemical leaks and cause a mass fatality event. I had arsen gas in my bedroom. We had multiple people with chemical exposure injuries. They've self-reported dumping a bunch of carcinogens and really dangerous stuff into the air. They could easily be creating another Superfund site under that facility right then. And then there's a creek flowing to the Pacific Ocean right next door. And it's polluted like crazy. So I was in East Coast for a couple years trying to get work. I just recently got back. One of the first things I did was go check out that creek. And like Santa Clara has set it up so you can't even really see it. I had to like climb down in the concrete culvert. And I'm like trying to see like what's going on next to where their stormwater outfall is. And it is like frothy, it's bubbly, there's chemical sheens, it's weird colors. And so then I got a bunch of tests on the internet of like the cheap like test your drinking water type stuff. So I climb back in the culvert and I'm like running the tests, and it's like high ammonia and chlorine and high alkaline and high TDS. And I'm like, what? So Clean Water Act, because if that's coming from and they've already been cited for stormwater pollution too, that's going to the San Tomas and Saratoga Creek, which flows to, I believe it's still the Vizsla Slough, and then Pacific Ocean, San Francisco Bay. So whether it's imminent, substantial, and ongoing endangerment to the environment around this fab or the people around it, I'm really hoping the court will side with me. The hearing's currently scheduled for June 25th. It's public. It's in San Jose Courthouse, right next door. We're going to have a press conference, and hopefully if people can show up and be there and show community support would be really, really great. It's a local judge, and the whole concept of these suits is if the federal and local enforcement fails in these sites and it is such a danger to people in the environment, it's supposed to be someone affected locally who cares enough about that safety risk to bring it to a court. And it's supposed to be, needs to be a court closest to where the issue is, because they want a local judge to be accountable to the community who could be exposed themselves to sit there and think through of like, what's the right thing to do here? Because whatever this is, fill through all the cracks. If it is that dangerous and it can cause that many issues, they need, that judge is supposed to be like the final line. So I'd love for him to see the community there and show the support on this. And I really hope that Santa Clara has some reflection time about the decisions they've made about this. One of the reasons that we've had a lot of these issues at these cities is these cities get captured. And they're sometimes the only line of defense at these facilities. They're the ones doing the inspections, approving the plans, the ones that might flag to another agency if they're missing permits. And if they're captured, they'll just let whatever slide. Then you only find out when there's an incident. So we really need to hold them accountable too. And I've found too through this battle, I have the retaliation case I filed in September 2023, and we're still going. We're deep in discovery. I just filed my own motion for summary judgment that I should win at least partially on the merits of my stuff even before trial, because I feel so strongly in my case. It's really unusual for a plaintiff to file one of those motions, and the judge not only is letting me do it, but is letting me ask to get it back on my payroll before the trial, if I win. Should be great, because I can't pay rent and I can't buy anything. I'm just living off Twitter donations, so that would be helpful to have some money again. But I'm also just really grateful I've made it this far. Most cases against these huge companies end up getting dismissed like immediately. Or at least before discovery, or have limited discovery. I've been able to depose 5 corporate witnesses now. You get to sit down the other side and interrogate them for up to 7 hours. They're really expensive though. Even like a half day was like $1,500 each for the court reporter. But you get to sit down your witnesses. So I had 2 employee relations people. I had my senior director, my vice president. I had another guy who was like a subject matter expert on something Apple says they fired me over. And get to ask them whatever you want that's relevant, and you have a court reporter transcribing it all. That becomes your evidence for trial, whatever they say. And then next week, Apple is really fighting this, but you also can depose corporations, and they have to send a witness to answer on behalf of the corporation or institution or agency or whatever it is. So whatever that witness says is transcribed as Apple Inc. says. And I had to ask about all the environmental issues, protected activity, retaliation, termination, all this stuff. And Apple was fighting it a bunch. And the judge actually called Apple unreasonable and ordered them to sit for it. So we have 2 days next week, we get to do it. And I try to tell people too, like, the only way I stay sane, and I think other people should think of it too if you're doing a battle like this, is like every little win is a huge win. And you don't have to see it as like this is how I do my really long projects too. Because they'd give me the projects no one wants to do, and we're going to be miserable, and it was my job to motivate people. Think of it in little increments. Every success, segmental success is a huge success. Celebrate it. Find ways to like magnify that. And I've never allowed myself to say, this is only worth it if I have this outcome at the end. Because I think, especially with whistleblower stuff, you're probably not going to get a good outcome. It's always some version of terrible. Even the great stories are like, still pretty depressing. You know, no one has like a full redemption story because it's retaliation and the whole system's rigged. So I just try to celebrate those successes whenever I can get them. And through all this too, my number one priority has been just sharing. Like, no matter how embarrassing stuff is or how vulnerable I feel, because Apple's done a lot of character attacks too, and social harassment and mobbing and all this stuff.
RICO.
I did file a RICO lawsuit against them. It was dismissed without prejudice. I could still refile it. Really try to keep people motivated of like, at least sharing and documenting stuff is this huge act of resistance. And I was studying law. I wanted to work in human rights law. I was studying transitional justice, which is helping societies recover from civil war and mass atrocities. And it's a really targeted area of study because it's really complex. It's lots of compromises. It's lots of customized strategy for whatever that region's dealing with, whatever their histories is, whatever the violence is. And so I've tried to transplant that kind of strategy onto what I'm doing here and when I share with other people of like, I would say if you're going to go on one of these journeys, especially if you're doing it without, so lawyers generally will just be like, stay quiet and we're just going to try to get a settlement and wrap it up. But like if you're going to do some version of it with advocacy, it doesn't have to be in court at all, or agencies. You could just do like public advocacy or filing complaints to agencies about the substantive issues. Oh, this is something I bring up a lot. If I had known that like OSHA just retaliates and covers stuff up, I would have never filed stuff with them. They're horrible. Like they've emotionally brutalized me. OSHA's horrible. But then when I filed stuff to EPA about the original environmental violations, I was able to get action. And I was like, oh, I think it's a trick. They want you to just focus on the retaliation stuff, where it's all rigged and it's never going to come out in your favor and they waste for years and they'll never investigate the original issues. But you could also just file stuff about the original issues. And you could do legislative advocacy. You could talk to like elected representatives, local too, it doesn't have to be federal. You could do newspaper advocacy, a lot of this stuff. So like customize, what does justice look like for you? For each person. And a lot of it, and this is something they found in transitional justice, is it's generally not adjudication. It's generally truth commissions. One of the best ways to help societies recover from mass atrocities, civil wars, fascism, is just to get the truth out there of what happened, have people admit to stuff. And you generally can't do it with adjudications and litigation because your warlords and stuff get really defensive. And they don't want to tell you what they did because then you might send them to The Hague. So they clam up, they won't tell you stuff. So oftentimes they end up giving amnesty to the war crime perpetrators, which can be controversial, but as a society generally decides they'd rather have admissions of what happened, it can actually lead to a lot of healing. People want to know where their family members are buried. They want to know what happened during whatever battles and massacres and stuff. And so that to me helped educate me on how I wanted to do this, because what I saw with Apple was like, a bunch of buried atrocities in labor and environmental and cover up and all this stuff. And I was like, I think the least I can do of seeing all this and having my own story is like at least expose that and give that to other people. And I've had just an outpouring for years of people when they find that, especially Apple employees, of just thanking me because they couldn't say it. Most of them are gagged, felt like they couldn't at all, or they were too afraid to, or didn't feel like they had an audience. So just having someone bring it out there to bring that validation, help people become aware, it felt really healing to them. So I also encourage people to think about that of it doesn't have to be the prescribed whistleblower journey. If you end up on that conveyor belt to destruction, there's other ways to do it. And I think one of the best things we could do is try to create more community, especially for whistleblowers. We have like unions and labor organizing, but those are often captured. The big unions are a huge problem too. That's been a problem for decades. And whistleblowers are generally left out of that. So if whistleblowers, we should at least have each other's backs, and there's stuff we can share with each other and try to educate each other. But whistleblowers are generally really divided and isolated, and they do it, the corporations and entities do that on purpose. So really encourage people to like have each other's backs and find more ways for us to organize and to think cross-functionally. So like with my story, it became very clear to me that I wasn't just a labor organizer or whistleblower, I was a community organizer about environmental health. And that was the way they did in the 90s, especially about this stuff. Because when you have one of those chip fabs with all that, the chemical stuff, you have workers being exposed, you have cover-ups and stuff with, administratively whatever they're doing, generally fraud cases too. But then you have the community who can be exposed from the acute exposures, but then also the contamination. So you'd have just hyper-local community organizing about those type of issues holistically. And there was a lot more progress than trying to go separately. I have a question.
Whatever happened to silicon toxics quality? Are they still around? Did they ever help you? You know who they are?
Ted.
Yeah, Ted Smith. Yeah.
I talked to Ted briefly. He's currently in a partnership with Apple.
That explains it.
So, okay, Ted and Amanda are legends, and I can't talk negatively about them. They're forever.
Oh, they're legends.
They're legends, so I don't want to disgrace their legendary status ever. They've done more than most people will ever do. Like, they save lives. They've established a huge amount of academic work and advocacy work. But they currently are doing a new type of thing that is in like a partnership with Apple, and I have not been able to get assistance from them on that. But despite that, I would still recommend everyone go back and read the books they've written, the articles they've written, all of their work. It's absolutely phenomenal. They're some of the original folks doing this work.
One of the problems is business unionism. Business unionism is an ideology that you want to have a partnership with the company.
Yeah.
That's the ideology that dominates the unions in the United States. So they don't want to fight the company. They don't want to expose this. And also, if they get a contract, some unions, my union gets contracts, they'll give up things like spying on workers or military spying. Let's not talk about that, and we'll accept a union. So this is part of the problem of business union. The union should be upfront organizing for the members and the community. If they did that, they'd have much more support. And that means building a working class movement.
Yeah.
We've got to bring the community and workers together so we back each other up, so we can get educated. The unions are trying to organize, and they have been fired. Apple has fired many, many organizers. In fact, they're still fighting at the IEM and my union, CWA. They fire them, but the unions are in a war. But I would say it's a one-sided war. It's a one-sided war, and the reason is they're not going for the jugular with these companies. You have to put the companies on trial because they're really criminals. They're conspiring to violate the law every day. It's like workers' compensation. They're conspiring to screw workers, and they have to be put on trial. They should be going to prison. They should be going to prison. You and I would go to prison if we did what they did.
So let me illuminate that, because Steve says this stuff that might sound inflammatory to people watching at home, but he's right. And so sometimes you have to step back and be like, let me give you a factual example to show that Steve is actually just saying completely truthful things, because that's how the world works, especially here. So like Apple, why did Apple fire me? They didn't tell me at the time. They gave some hints like maybe a week later. They had a position statement to OSHA in 2022, still pretty vague. Even like a year into the litigation, they still would not give a concrete reason. And then it's finally like only in the last like month with court orders compelling them are they giving finally details. They fired me 5 years ago. So like when an employer wants to fire an employee, they come up with some nonsense reason. And it could be like anything, like they were late 3 times, so we decided to fire them. Performance issues, not a team player. Just make up stuff. It's not that hard. And then the employee has to go in and prove, actually they're lying. It was my protected stuff. Here's all the evidence to show that they're lying, and it was actually this stuff, and you can tell their motive, and that's why I should win. Getting Apple to like fess up, and even the stuff they hinted to, it's all illegal itself. Like their legitimate reason for firing me is all illegal. So like the first thing, and still they're saying like the primary, was me complaining about unethical AI development processes with them doing data collection of biometrics and photos and videos of employee data and anyone around them without informed consent and violating laws, and they shouldn't be doing it that way. And the thing they pointed to that I was protesting that they fired me for was me saying they're gathering all this data of me. Like, so my phone was taking like videos and capturing my biometrics and GPS data from the front-facing camera whenever it thought it saw a face was in front of the camera, with no notification or anything. It was just happening in the background, but capturing all this data on the phone and then uploading to Apple. And I was like, I really don't like that. And my protest at the time was like, I'm seeing that there's culture of retaliation and intimidation and cover-ups. Why wouldn't their teams use that data to spy on me? They'd know where I am. They have all these pictures, all this information of me. That's like really creepy. And I would show people, like, because it's like surveillance footage basically on this phone. So I was showing pictures. I'm like, look at this. This is so creepy, you guys. Then Apple said that was leaking. That I leaked the surveillance pictures of me in my pajamas in my living room. And then it was like, it was an offense worth an immediate termination that I was complaining apparently about retaliation and surveillance. And I was like, that's illegal. Because also right now we're looking really hard at these companies of how they're creating these AI products, especially their data collection. Where are they getting this data? And are they taking it from customers and consumers? Are they taking it from the public? Where are they even getting it? And Apple using this thing was getting people like from the public who wouldn't even know, and then saying if employees warned them, they'd fire them. So that's not great. That's unlawful. And then for employees, for decades now, it's like human research. Like, you don't use employees for it because it's coercive. Employees can't reasonably say no because it's your employer. So if there's stuff that's like a strong invasion of privacy or very personal data, they're not supposed to ask employees. And this is like codified in GDPR in France and Germany. Like, you don't use employees for stuff because they can't actually consent. They can't say no without being afraid they're going to be fired. And then if that was ever a question, Apple answered it by saying, we fired her for complaining about this thing she consented to. And because she consented, she can't complain or tell anyone we're doing it, is their official position. And I said, that's illegal. You can't say that. So I actually like flipped it back on them when I filed the lawsuit. Because in California, we have it's called a TAMNI claim. It's a termination in violation of public policy. And so if the employer is going to fire someone for a reason that violates public policy, it doesn't matter if there's an express statute or not saying it's unlawful. You can cite the California Constitution. You can cite like acts of the legislator. In California, there's a very strong protection for the California right to privacy, which is in the Constitution, Article 1 of the California Constitution, that's self-executing and applies to private employment. It's actually very unusual. And it generally protects the employee's right to protest invasions of privacy by the employer. And the employer is not allowed to fire the employee for protesting that the employer is violating their privacy. And there's tests of like what kind of violation is severe enough to meet that threshold. But it's a pretty well-developed case law. And I was literally protesting you invading my privacy. And you said that's why you fired me. So I win already. Let's do this. And that's the jugular thing, right? Like, that's with these companies realizing you have to go really offensive because they've already rigged the system. They've gamed the system. And even with me, and I think the judge already knows too, I'm going to win on this. The way he's been handling, talking about the motion for summary judgment, me getting back on payroll, is like, I filed that September 2023, and this case is still going. Our trial's not till October. I'm homeless. I'm in Chapter 7 bankruptcy. I'm insolvent. It's taking forever, but I should win. Because the thing they said is their legitimate reason for firing me is unlawful. And I'm like, but you also fired me for all the environmental stuff, like when you almost killed. So I have a claim for crime victim retaliation under the California Labor Code. You can't retaliate against someone for being a crime victim. And I have a pled claim that the judge has let move forward as in discovery that they committed crimes when they were dumping all that toxic waste in 2020. And I was a victim of their crimes because they almost killed me. That's a violent crime. Environmental crime can be violent crime under the violent crime statutes if you're physically harmed by whatever chemical stuff they're doing. And I said one of the reasons they fired me was because they almost killed me with that stuff, and they knew, and I was complaining about it, and they're covering it up. And that's one of my claims right now. So I said, that's one of the reasons you fired me. You fired me because of the EPA inspection, and the cracks in the floor, and that HVAC thing where you put the poison into our HVAC vents. But also that AI stuff and surveillance is very unlawful too. And then just in the last month with these depositions where I'm interrogating the executives, it came out like their most vague mention of one of the reasons of what it actually was. And it was me actually complaining about sexual harassment. This was at the end when I was like, I'm going to get fired anyway. So here's all my complaints. You should investigate them all because you're already retaliating. So it's just retaliation. It's unlocked now, I guess. So I had my full list of grievances. It's like 33 pages of my issue confirmation. And one of the things I complained about was my senior director in 2017 I was at a restaurant he wanted me to go to, and he was trying to get me to have like a sexual relationship with a sous chef, and he and my VP were really close to the chef and like friends with the restaurant, and they all bought my dinner. It was like a couple $100 while trying to get me to date the sous chef. And I was like, just generally inappropriate. I think Apple should look into that, have a talk with them. You know, it's just weird. And my senior director had like even said in text it was one of the worst things he's ever done. And I was like friendly with him and his family, and his daughter even said they talk about it a lot at dinner about how inappropriate it was like years later. And so I thought that should be like non-controversial to bring to HR and be like, you should just have a talk with them and explain stuff, because they're missing, I think, some laws for at least like 40 years. Got to catch them up a little bit. And Apple, like, they have 3 reasons they say they fire me of like the legitimate reason that wasn't all the other stuff. That's one of them. They said that I mischaracterized it and misled them because I apparently texted that night that the sous chef was cute. Therefore, I wanted it and can't complain later. I said, that's been illegal since like 1960. That's like, you can't, that's crazy. So it's clear why they're covering that one up after the fact. And then I'm just reflecting of like, they're trying to trick the VP to like sign off on firing me while I was on Twitter and doing all these news articles and stuff. So they provoked him. They also misled him to think it was his friend, the head chef, not even the guy that it was actually about. So he admitted during deposition, he's like, I didn't even know it was about the other guy. I thought it was about my friend. And I was like reading the text message thread. He's like, oh, I had no idea actually. But he's like, but you misled, and that's why we fired you. So like I was working on my motion of like I should win already, and I had to add all that in because I'm like, you just admitted to violating a bunch of laws. That's really weird. Like, what are you guys doing? And then the third reason was they had investigators wanting to talk to me, like out of nowhere, being like, get on the phone like within the hour. And I asked for stuff in writing because I had an NLRB affidavit the next day. And I said, you guys have been misrepresenting a lot of stuff I said. You're kind of scary right now. Happy to talk to you, but like to keep it in writing. Let me know what you want. And then within like less than 50 minutes, they said I refused to cooperate and they're suspending all my account access. And then a couple of hours later fired me. And so their third reason was, and I got them to admit this on deposition, that I asked for communication in writing because they made up a rule that could only be on the phone with no paper trail. And I said, I want to tell the government. And they were saying it was confidential. So I was like, so you're saying whatever happened on the phone would be confidential and I can't tell NLRB? And they said, yes. And then one of those investigators also said the whole point to get me on the phone was to ask me if I thought the sous chef was cute. I said, that's illegal too. You guys are crazy. So all that to say, when Steve said they're all criminals and should go to jail, yes, they should. But it's like so rare to get to the point where I am interrogating them and getting all these answers and having them to actually say this stuff, especially a company like Apple. So that's one of those things where I'm like, let's just celebrate. We got all this crazy stuff on paper. I filed the motion. These deposition transcripts are on the docket now. It's public. And Apple's going to have to live with this. And now, like tonight, they're supposed to be filing their response of like why it's actually okay to fire someone for protesting surveillance and unethical AI development processes and reporting sexual harassment and asking for a paper trail to share with the government. I'm sure they'll say something crazy, you know? So it's also just been very awakening through this whole process to, the only comparison I found for the trauma I was experiencing, I found with veterans. With therapy for veterans and these concepts of moral injury and institutional betrayal. Because I was suffering on such like an existential spiritual level through all of this, of just questioning everything. Couldn't believe the stuff was happening and the stuff I was seeing. And the only thing I could find to like ground myself were these concepts that veterans often come back from combat, especially with unjust wars. And they're coming back and they're traumatized. They went through real trauma, but they also feel betrayed by their country, their employer. They feel like they participate in something they don't agree with. They often will have like acute experiences from battle too, where it's something that like really conflicted with their ethical beliefs. And then it's like, how do you get past the trauma itself, but also that like spiritual trauma? And there's actually really good books about it and studies. Jacqueline Garrick, she's a Veterans Association whistleblower, and she's done a lot of stuff with Whistleblowers of America and trying to help whistleblowers, has written about this stuff too, and tried to like document in articles the like checklist of retaliation and the reasonably foreseeable results that happen in people, the whistleblowers, when they're faced this retaliation. Because the employer goes through their checklist of like, let's gaslight them, let's make up stories, get their coworkers to harass them, turn everyone against them. And then the employee facing that is going to go through depression, anxiety, and all these kind of emotional problems, because that's what the employer's trying to create. And a lot of it is just trying to get the employee to quit. So that was something that I really fought with Apple about, because I could tell they're trying to get me to quit. They're making it as hostile as possible. They're like keeping it so just clear that like the longer you stay, the more we're going to accuse you of stuff and make everyone so mad at you, and it's just going to be miserable for you. So like, just give up now. Then I was talking to other people who did that. You know, when I was on Twitter, started complaining about this stuff, and then people reach out and they're like, I regret it. I really wish I had done something, said something. And like, it was one of their biggest regrets. So that's when I was calling out Mr. Suicide Nets, Tony. And I was like, Tony, it seems like you guys are just trying to get me to quit. And the lawyers are explaining it to me too, that like, it's really, really hard to win hostile work environment cases when you quit. So you're going to argue it's a constructive termination, that they basically fired you even if they didn't fire you. And those cases are really, really hard to prove. And even the termination ones are hard to prove, but you kind of need them to fire you if they're going to fire you. So like, lawyers too are telling me, like, you just got to stick it out. They're going to fire you. If they don't fire you, great, you still have a job. Sounds like they're going to fire you though, you know? So wait for them to do it, and then you file it. So I told him, I'm like, Tony, it sounds like your game plan here is just make it as miserable as possible until I bow out and I just quit and try to like figure out what to do next. But I think we should just see how this goes. I think you should investigate all of my complaints. You should actually have to be forced to have some kind of outcome from it. You should be forced to tell me what you're going to do to follow up, to resolve these issues. I would love for you to give me a place to work that's not a hostile work environment so I can keep working at Apple. Then they suspended me and then fired me a couple weeks later. So I also try to educate people about that checklist, because it is really, really predictable. And whistleblowers are just kind of stuck in the same pathway. And labor organizers, anyone getting retaliated against, even filing like sexual harassment complaints. Apparently you can just get fired for that now in 2021, right? That's what Apple's saying, that I was fired for reporting sexual harassment. So anyone that starts seeing that like pattern of retaliation, it's so predictable. And I think the more that we are educated about that, why they're doing each thing, what each thing is, we give it labels, we like make it more clinical of what they're doing. Hopefully that takes away some of the stigma. People are feeling less like it's personal. They try to make it feel so personal. I think that's one of the reasons they make so many false allegations and try to make the person feel like they did something wrong. Because then you're just internalizing, you're not talking to anyone, you're not seeing the patterns and the systems. So I think the more that we see it as a system, a checklist, a predictable thing that they're doing, we're organizing with each other and can have each other's backs. And we can have tools like document all your stuff. Have like one document where all your complaints, and like make them have to address that. There's a couple emails I missed and they're weaponizing them, but like making sure if they send some email with some kind of incorrect thing, send a response and correct it. Because they'll say like, if you didn't respond to whatever email, you were like acquiescing to whatever it was or whatever. So like be really diligent on your paper trail. It might not seem like it at the time. And especially the couple things I didn't respond to were just so inflammatory. I'm not going to dignify that with a response, was kind of my position at the time. And then that's the stuff they're trying to weaponize now. So I'm like, reply to everything, no matter how like ridiculous it is. Clarify everything. And one of the most controversial things is the self-serve evidence. So like employers will say employees shouldn't take any files themselves. And then you go to litigation and you're in discovery and you're trying to get copies of the documents and they'll hold them back. They'll try to get your case dismissed before you could ever get a copy of stuff. So you have no evidence yourself. And I went kind of rogue. I don't know if I'd recommend this. Definitely not legal advice. But I took a ton of documents with me at the time. And I told Tony, Mr. Suicide Nets, I have an external hard drive and I'm copying all my non-confidential stuff that's the records of all these complaints and all these EHS stuff. My labor law class says that this stuff's protected. If you want to stop me, you should stop me now. So I took a ton of documents and they haven't really been able to fight it because I documented at the time I was taking them. And that I think changed the whole dynamic with my lawsuit because I came in with all my evidence already. Normally people are fighting for like a year to even get anything. So I think really being creative, trying to think outside the box, but also knowing that like anything you try to do to get an advantage, they're going to claim as more misconduct, try to get you sanctioned. You know, that's the litigation with them is wild. These lawyers are like partners. The main one on the retaliation case against me like ran all employment retaliation and discrimination defense for a huge firm for like over a decade. She was the one running it. Now she's just the other side. It's just impossible. You know? They're very clever and crafty. They're constantly scheming. I tell them, I'm learning a lot. I'm taking field notes. Like, I would love to write a book after all of this of just what I've been able to reverse engineer as I've watched them do this stuff. Because it is very strategic, but it's not like calculus. It's not that complicated. Just very rowdy. And so I think that's another gap I've seen, and Steve and I talk about this a lot, of like when everyone just has a lawyer representing them, the lawyers that's their profession. And so they're not going to talk crap about the other side, openly to the press. They're not going to call out the games. They're not going to say the court's acting corrupt and, violating labor laws and all that. So one of the advantages I've had is like, I'm representing myself. I can't get a job anyways. I'm already like permanently deny listed from anything I'd want to do. So I'm like, I want to be respectful of the court, but at the same time, I'm like, I'm never going to work at a firm anyways, so I'm just going to call stuff out. And so I think also having like a disinfecting light of sunshine on the litigation process itself. Oh, and so like one of the things I found during mine is that lawyer, that firm is trying to use something in discovery called a protective order. It's basically like a new NDA on me, a new non-disclosure agreement, where they're just unilaterally claiming stuff now as secret and trying to get the court to tell me it's secret and get gag orders against me on stuff that was like my own complaints, like whistleblower complaints and labor complaints. And it's been a whole thing. We had a rally about it, and I'm currently under part of it still. And I'm trying not to, this is like the balance where I'm like, I don't want to be held in contempt. And I do need these judges to find in my favor on the substantive stuff. So I'm like having to make these compromises, but I'm still complaining. So I'm not saying the stuff they said I can't say, and it's really ridiculous. If you go look at the history of it, it's really ridiculous what they're trying to say is secret. But now I'm like, I think I'm seeing how so many of these employees, my coworkers, are claiming they can't talk about anything. Because that lawyer, when I was protesting her using this thing, she said she uses it in every single case. And they're meant for like actual confidential information, like trade secret cases. But if she's using it in every case, then they must just be going in and claiming all protected activity and all misconduct by the employer is secret. And then because it's discovery, you're bringing it to like a discovery magistrate judge who's just skimming over stuff to see if like evidence is admissible, but not looking at the merits about whether that's like an okay reason to fire someone. Or labor laws. Like I kept objecting. I'm like, labor laws say all of this is protected. And silence no more. Some of it was like more sexual harassment stuff. So I was like, silence no more and Speak Out Act. All of that says that you can't restrict me from speaking about this. She's like, it's discovery. I'm like, it's discovery. So no laws apply? Apparently not. So like that's another thing I want to write a book about at the end of this is like how apparently these employers find all these loopholes to just bypass like whole statutory protections and civil rights laws and just know how to work these courts and these litigation processes and still get the end result they want.
And stopping you using from AI.
They also were like, they've tried to find any way possible to make sure that I slip up in any way they can try to get me in trouble for. And, I'm just myself, and they're huge. They've had, I think they're up to 7 firms on the other side now. Over, 20 lawyers on the other side overall. Even in the retaliation case right now, it's 4 lawyers on the other side. And it's Oric. It's this huge firm. And they try to get me, sanctioned and my stuff dismissed and denied if I'm, a minute late filing it. A paragraph over the page limit. Use a font they think the judge might not like. Whatever it is, and they'll file an emergency motion to deny all of Ashley's rights. And it's a huge firm, and it's Apple, so the court, what I learned, will oftentimes just go along with whatever they say. It's Apple. They like their iPhone. Judge likes his iPhone, or whatever it is, And I'm realizing why they don't really teach litigation in law school. When I was in law school, they don't teach litigation. You can't really teach it. It's more of an experience. I think going through the process and just realizing it's all pretty actually arbitrary and hard to predict and a lot of power dynamics and playing games and all of that. So they also were trying to get me in trouble for trying to use AI tools to try to help me productivity-wise. Because if I am doing so much stuff and I don't have time and I need to have all these cases and all this stuff organized, really complex, and I don't have a team to help me like they do, I was like, maybe AI can help and try to streamline some of this because I apparently have to meet this deadline and have all this stuff done and it's just impossible. Then they tried to get the court to say I can't use AI. They've threatened to do that in the environmental state too. They wanted to bring in the retaliation judge yelling at me about I had 1 citation that there was an issue and I got this whole scolding about it, and they wanted to bring it to the other judge to proactively tell me not to use AI or miss any deadlines. And I'm like, what if we litigate on the merits and talk about what you did instead of this? And so that's been illuminating also of like, just really seeing the games they play, that they want to avoid at all possible to actually have evidence to talk about what the actual substantive claims are. And they play a ton of games and it works a lot of the time. But the AI thing's extra funny too, because then they're also firing me for complaining about their AI practices and don't want me using AI, and it's really exhausting. They can use it, and I can't talk about it, but I can't use it or complain about them.
How many cases do you have pending then?
See, so in the courts, I have the retaliation lawsuit, and then I filed the environmental lawsuit separately, and so that one's like not me, I'm just stepping in for the community, so I don't get anything out of that one. That's all for like litigation. I have the NLRB case, we had the settlement on the NDAs, and then they were supposed to be suing over my termination. I'm appealing their dismissal of that after Apple put their own lawyer in charge. But I still have the case that they had scheduled a hearing for on like their threats and intimidation and unlawful rules. The Department of Labor one is just stalled forever in the bowels of OSHA. But that's supposed to be, I appealed their dismissal of the ALJ was basically saying that the hazardous waste laws just don't apply to Apple, is what Apple argued, and he just agreed. So I had argued at the very least it was retaliation under the Superfund laws. It was a Superfund site, and I was complaining about the Superfund site like mitigation systems, and they clearly were retaliating. There was an inspection, and Apple argued, and this judge decided that the Superfund laws only apply, the retaliation ones, if the employer is the one who did the original pollution, which doesn't make any sense, because Superfund is usually for abandoned sites, actually. So most of the sites will not have an original polluter even still around. The business is probably like out of business. Let alone you can have these huge sites with lots of businesses on top. So like that doesn't make any sense. There was no legal basis. And then argued that also the employees only has the legal protections if their assigned office is on that Superfund site in question, which also doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to win the appeal, and that's why OSHA's been sitting on it for like a year. It's now gone to the Department of Labor Administrative Review Board, where it's just gathering dust and marinating, and I don't know if they're ever going to do anything. And it was reassuring to me to read Darrell Whitman's disclosures, and then there's like decades of Government Accountability Office reports and scathing like watchdog reports about this group, that they just don't investigate anything. Their merit findings are like 1%, just abysmal. and they've had like congressional, this is federal OSHA. And overall it's Department of Labor has this whistleblower protection group where like basically all the federal statutes that provide whistleblower protection for making complaints, whether it's safety stuff under OSHA or it's airline stuff, antitrust, there's all financial stuff. They all gave it to OSHA, and it's just these little OSHA investigators that are supposed to investigate. And there's congressional hearings like Wells Fargo. When it came out, all the Wells Fargo fraud, there had been tons of complaints that got killed in OSHA, where OSHA didn't investigate, retaliated against the whistleblowers. Elizabeth Warren wrote some very strongly worded letters about the OSHA stuff, and that's how a bunch of those people got fired. And Darrell Whitman's group, I believe, was outfall from that, because if the whistleblower complaints had been investigated, and OSHA had escalated that stuff and done something, we probably wouldn't have had all that consumer fraud from Wells Fargo.
And Eric Holder allowed the Stump, the CEO of Wells Fargo, to leave with $100 million after they admitted massive fraud, set up fake bank accounts, and after they fired 5,000 workers, many of them because they didn't want to commit fraud.
And then that whistleblower group, they apparently fired their like frontline investigators, but kept all the executives who had ordered and greenlit all of the obstruction and concealment, and he was still there. Captain Para. I had a long talk with Captain Para. It was similar to my talk with Tony, Mr. Suicide Nets, where I'm like, what are we doing here? Seems like you have quite an operation you're running. Doesn't seem to be doing what you say it is. I have a lot of concerns. So we didn't get along very well. I reported them to like other agencies too. They didn't like it. I got Elizabeth Warren. I tried to do a FOIA request for my case file too, because I wanted, one of the things that I've been trying to do that I got advice from lawyers earlier on and like other advocate and organizers is file a bunch of agency stuff. And even if they diddle-daddle and they're not actually moving, you're going to force the employer to have to put a statement on the record. And most of the time when the employers are acting very bad, that's good because it's going to be nonsense. And they're going to want to change it later. You want to like really get them held into whatever nonsense they have to come up with right away. And so I did my unemployment appeal. That was a similar thing. They didn't put anything on the record for the unemployment appeal. And I won my appeal, but it was the Department of Labor OSHA where they had to do a position statement of why we fired her. That was the March 2022 one. I introduced that with my motion for summary judgment just like a week ago because I'm like, look what they said there. Now they're saying all this other stuff. Nothing here but sexual harassment. They hid that. So you can point out all these inconsistencies. So it makes me feel a little bit better that some of those cases with the agencies went nowhere, but I at least got like paperwork out of it. And I learned that they're nonsense, and I can like complain about that forever now and try to get because I'm like, if they just act like this and no one's going to fix it, we shouldn't be putting taxpayer money to fund that stuff. And it's misleading because people think there's a functioning group that actually investigates this stuff and protects whistleblowers. But if they're doing the opposite and using taxpayer money to do illegal retaliation, that's nonsense. Kind of in a controversial position, but I'm like, I would rather you just shut it down. If you're not going to actually do it, no one's going to fix it. I don't want you to say you have it, especially when you're using it to hurt people. Because then people go in not even knowing, and they're going to be worse off. That's my position on the Department of Labor Whistleblower Protection Program. And in retrospect, it makes sense in the U.S. No businesses would tolerate a group that actually investigated whistleblower complaints and did something about it. Like, if you think about it, the businesses would get that shut down right away. So, of course, it doesn't do anything. So I've learned a lot through that process. In California's done nothing. They had a Department of Labor group, and they said the investigations to even start was like 3 to 4 years out after filing the complaint. Tried to report stuff to OSHA. They wouldn't do anything. California has a bunch of great laws on the books about like employee privacy, labor organizing, but won't actually enforce any of it. Like, they warned me that like their merit findings are really low too, and after they start investigating, it'd take more years. So it was like 8 years later, maybe they might do something. But that's crazy.
Less than 200 inspectors for 18 million workers.
The thing I realized about California is it's a very hypocritical and like false advertising type state where they have a lot of stuff on the books that sounds great and they can say they're really progressive, but then they understaff all their agencies, they don't allocate all the resources needed to actually do any of this stuff. And so none of it actually happens, and then they have an excuse of like, well, we don't have the money or people. But I'm like, because you didn't give them money or people, so they can't do it. And they know. And like, if I'd try to get sometimes the people working at California Department of Labor talking, just to confirm, and when I can get them ranting of like, oh, I know, I really wish we had more people, we can't do any of this. I'm like, I knew it.
And the Democratic legislature cut the budget of OSHA $16 million.
That's like their entire budget.
Well, the big cut when they
I know.
less than 200 inspectors
Yeah.
for 18 million workers. I mean, they don't want workers protected. They don't want them to do their job.
And I had filed a complaint like about the AI practices, the stuff Apple was saying it fired me over. I filed a bunch of complaints internationally too when I got that letter in 2022 with them saying, oh, part of this was that AI stuff. Because I'm like, that's really unlawful. And like legislators and agencies should know this is Apple's position because it's unlawful. Apple should be investigated for even saying this. Because there should be a lot of questions. Like the Face ID thing was actually, there were inquiries from Congress about where they were getting the data to create Face ID. Because Apple said they already had 1 billion images. And there was letters from Congress saying, where'd you get those 1 billion images? And Apple's response was like, it's very consensual, but that's all we'll say. And I was like, I can tell you where they got them. And I have paperwork saying that they say they will fire any employee who tries to tell anyone where they got them. And that employee was complaining that it seems unethical. It's a misuse of employees and should be investigated. And they said that's why they'd fire an employee. Back to Steve saying they're all criminals and should be in jail, And I got in-depth coverage, mostly in France and Germany and UK. I got good like international coverage of it, which they're doing that stuff in those countries too, so they cared. And I got a CNIL investigation, which is the French data authority. I got an article in Der Spiegel in Germany when Munich was investigating. But in California, where there's the strongest laws on a lot of this, nothing. I'd filed a complaint to the AG explaining what was happening, and the California Department of Labor said it'd be like 8 years before I'd hear anything. And they just said, all of this goes to the Department of Labor, we won't do anything ourselves. But I was like, it's like consumer data, it's consumer products. Won't do anything. So like just realizing it's like a black hole of regulatory oversight, which is why I've been trying to make noise about it. And that is one thing they're not even trying to say is It's kind of funny because they're saying we fired her because it was so secret, it was so confidential. But now they're like, they won't even say it. They're not even claiming it's confidential now. So I don't know what they're going to come up with.
They never thought it would go this far.
They tried really hard. They did a lot of stuff that I think would have been very demoralizing and probably stopped a lot of people. But I think mostly because it was my job to work on impossible projects with impossible teams and everyone wants to give up all the time. And it was my job to make sure it all happened successfully, that it really was just like, I don't know how to give up.
That's why Apple products are so good. You made them
I don't
by
know.
your job. I mean, actually.
I don't know. They more created their own problems by like underfunding and under-resourcing everything and poor planning, but sure.
And Apple workers would like a union, but they're terrorized. They terrorize the workers.
So like the retail groups have been trying to unionize. There was good articles, some good articles, not enough, about the union busting going on. It was really brutal. And Apple is trying to block a lot of unions. And the like one store that got a union, I think they even got a bargaining agreement. Apple's now shutting down the store and not letting them transfer out.
Right.
So just firing the entire store, which is really messed up. They filed a new NLRB charge about it, it sounds like. And with Apple's gag order stuff they've been doing to me recently in litigation, I filed, I think, 9 new NLRB charges. I told her, I was like, that lawyer, I was like, if you keep doing this, every time you say this stuff about my work conditions and my complaints being confidential, I'm just going to file a new NLRB charge. She apparently didn't believe me because she has like 9 new NLRB charges. Just kept sending them, like, here's your new one. Like, when are you guys going to stop? But they might feel cocky because Apple's in charge of the NLRB now with their lawyer in charge, but we'll see. And part of that also goes back to the like, I will not let myself make my advocacy right now contingent on a fixed outcome. Sure, Apple's in charge of the agency. I'm filing the complaints too. Sure, they already dismissed a bunch of stuff. Sure, it might not go anywhere. But I'm going to create the documentation trail. I'm writing detailed cover letters and submitting the evidence and getting in their dockets and creating that record. Because I'm like, at the very least, I'm reporting it. They might choose not to do anything, but I at least want to like create that just for the sake of creating it. And so I try not to discourage people from filing complaints or pursuing this stuff, even when it's kind of pointless, like Department of Labor, if they feel like they can get some kind of sense of justice and advocacy out of the truth-telling, the documentation creation, the process itself. And so part of it, I think we need a reframing until we can actually reform these agencies at some point, maybe.
A workers' government.
Yeah, that'd be nice. More unions, I think more independent unions especially. The big unions are so easy to get captured with these huge corporations. If we can have more independent unions, especially like the stuff that Ted Schmidt and Amanda Hawes were setting up in the 90s here, there was a lot of community organizing with labor organizing. It was really holistic. There was really great work from those days that I think should inform stuff here, especially. But right now it's not working. It's just a black hole. Yeah.
Well, recently I used to know the guy, did a lot of organizing for the Workers' Memorial Day, which involves a lot of this stuff. He died, his name was Dennis. He died in 2008, but I think Sally Lieber was involved in a lot of that as a legislator. They had an event on Workers' Memorial Day last week.
No.
They should have invited you.
I was at yours.
Yeah, we did.
Steve had one. I spoke at Steve's.
We had a national one of workers from all over the country. Teamsters, longshoremen. I mean, it was quite a good event. Becky, a molecular biologist at Pfizer, was retaliated against. All kinds of workers, longshore workers.
Yeah.
And, you know, so many people are hurt and killed. And also, if you get injured on the job, they stall on your health care. So you become permanently disabled. Unless you get quick, prompt health care, you can become permanently disabled. And that happens to so many people. They lose their homes, they lose their jobs, they end up homeless. I mean, it's a nightmare for
Did you sign up for
injured
workers'
workers.
comp?
So
Is that too difficult? That's too
no, it's its own story. So when I was making all these complaints about my office, and I had a fainting spell in 2019 at my office, and I was bringing up when I realized there was cracks in the floor and we could be exposed. I was telling HR, I was like, I think that fainting spell from 2019 was probably vapor intrusion, because it was the only thing like when I was fainting at my apartment with all the chip fab stuff. And so I told them, I'm like, I think there's been vapor intrusion. That would explain that really severe fainting spell I had. And then HR was like, oh, you got to file a workers' comp complaint about it. And I was like, that seems weird. Like, that was from 2019, and there's no evidence, and you guys never even recorded it. They pushed me to file it, so I filed it, and then they, like, immediately denied it. And I'm like, what was the point of me filing this? And they're like, well, it proves that there's no claim because we denied it. I was like, that's weird. That was one of the first things where I was like, I don't think what you're doing is normal. I think you're playing a lot of games, actually, and it makes me uneasy.
So you couldn't get disability either?
Well, it was just one fainting spell. So that's why I was like, what am I filing it over? I had a fainting spell in 2019, and one of our big fights is they're refusing to test the air inside the building until after they fix the cracked floor. See, even if you don't know how this stuff works, you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Because I'm like, how would we ever know what we were exposed to if we're being exposed to stuff if you don't test the air before you fix the problem that would cause the exposure? And they're like, exactly. You know, it's very clear that they're like, we want to cover up all the issues and any evidence of that we did anything wrong. So we're not going to test. And so that was our big fight. And the EPA protocol, says, like, you have to test before you fix it. Because how will you know if you fixed it if you don't have a before to compare the after to? And they're like refusing. So we're fighting a bunch. But without any documentation, if I was exposed to stuff, and if it was just a self-reported fainting spell, what am I getting from workers' comp? And so it was basically just a pointless thing. They had me file knowing they would then deny it and then say the denial was somehow evidence of something. And that was April, and I wasn't fired till September. So that was one of my first indications that they were just going to be playing a bunch of games. And that's when I was starting to get really mad, where I'm like, what are you even doing? And the games were like about my personal health and me filing regulatory paperwork and all this stuff, right? And I ended up hearing from a bunch of employees, actually, that they'd file complaints and Apple would push them to file a workers' comp claim or an ADA request or something that made no sense. Like, a lot of ADA requests in response to complaints about retaliation. And they're like, well, what if you request an ADA thing for this like anxiety you say you're feeling? And they'd say, like, what I was yelling at Tony of, like, what if you just fix the harassment and make them stop doing the retaliation? That would help my anxiety. I don't think I need ADA accommodations. You just need to get them to stop retaliating. It's like, we don't do that. You know, and then I'm realizing, like, it's all game. And a bunch of these coworkers had said some version of, they filed the paperwork that they themselves know makes no sense. And then Apple accuses them of some kind of fraud for filing the paperwork it told them to file that made no sense, saying it doesn't make any sense. Why'd you file that? And I had so many people think, I know. So I'm hearing these stories at the same time I'm seeing it play out. And that's where I was just like, oh, you guys. And that's so calling them like the employee retaliations team, because they really were. It was like this just checklist of crazy retaliation and cover-ups. And so it's been validating to see that they have just nonsensical explanations for any of the stuff in my case. And I get to like make that public and hopefully get, even if the judicial finding isn't in my favor, at least documenting the facts of what I've been able to expose. So that's on the record, that they'd say this stuff and do this stuff. Like, hopefully they get yelled at about firing someone for reporting sexual harassment. It's just so crazy. Or asking for a written record to share the government the day before an NLRB affidavit and them saying no. When I interrogated that investigator who was like the one accusing me of leaking, he actually said that it's his understanding that I wouldn't be allowed to tell the NLRB what was said on the phone. That Apple would claim it's confidential and I couldn't share with the government, and if I did, I'd be violating a rule. That would be misconduct. And a lot of the stuff they're saying is just facially violations of state and federal law. So each of these depositions I'm also e-filing to NLRB as evidence on my appeal. And I'm like, I think you should read this. There's some really interesting stuff they said. I think you'll be very curious about and probably want to ask some follow-up questions. And it was also just illuminating for me to see now with all this retrospective, me getting educated about labor laws and protections, of how lawless they are, the stuff they were saying without even realizing how unlawful it was. And so then I'm reflecting on like working there for so many years and being part of that culture and like feeling guilty that I didn't object more, I didn't step in, I didn't protect my coworkers more, because that's just the culture of just lawlessness. So again, just hoping at least getting stuff documented, getting public records of stuff will hopefully help the next person. I would love to beat Apple in court though too. That would be that would be a surprise, wonderful outcome. They might try just out of stubbornness. So like that was the thing. If I was going to do it and the lawyers told me that, I just need to be ready to see it all the way through. You know, And I could give up partway if I wanted to, but like, what's the point if you're going to invest? I should be ready to invest. And so I was like, yeah, no, I'll do it. I'll get it all the way through. So like, I'm ready to go to trial. We have the trial scheduled for October. It's in the San Francisco court. And we have a summary judgment hearing on June 11th. So that'll be open to the public too, so people can come in. And that's where I have my arguments of why I should win already. I have no idea what Apple's filing tonight. It's probably going to be really wild. But they're going to have to argue that stuff in a courtroom in person to the judge. So also I'm like, I hope you guys have some time thinking about the consequences of your actions. Even if you win, hopefully you had a moment of being like, maybe that wasn't the best idea. Maybe we shouldn't do that again.
So people can go to those hearings.
Yeah, they're all open to the public. I have public dockets on Court Listener. And my website, ashleygjovik.com, has links to all this stuff. Most of the court hearings, some of the gag order stuff they were doing was like closed, but almost everything else is open and in person. So like that citizen suit, all that stuff is in person in the San Jose court, just down the street. Would love for people to show up and show support. Be wonderful.
When's the San Jose one?
June 25th. We'll have one on the motion for preliminary injunction. They're trying to get stuff dismissed. Like Santa Clara wants out completely, and I'm like, no.
Well, we can have a press conference, June
Yeah.
25th at the San Jose Court.
What
Love to see
time
folks.
is it, do you know?
I believe that's 10 a.m.
And we can have a press conference at noon.
That'd be good.
Yeah.
Talk about how it goes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, even that, where it's like, these are such uphill battles, and it's very rare to win any of this stuff, but I'm like, just getting this on the record and forcing them to have to like explain their actions. Like Santa Clara is now they're having to be like, this is why we think it was fine to put an ultra hazardous chip fab next to a playground. And I'm like,
And the media aren't even covering it.
it's been mostly a blackout. We got that fascism blog to cover some of it, which is good. It was a fascism watch blog that was covering some of this. But the major media has not. Oh, you got NBC News, nightly news, to cover a protest.
I showed a clip and they didn't follow it up. See, I mean,
Yeah.
it's so brazen.
Yeah.
You're living next to a fab factory that's causing violations by releasing chemicals, and that's not a story?
Yeah.
That's not a story?
You can see the fab
People are
from the
getting
playground.
poisoned and it's not a story? I mean, who controls the media? I mean, they were told
Yeah.
by Apple, you better not cover this.
For sure.
Local residents.
Yeah, I
It
mean,
should be a local concern. It really should.
But we can make it an issue at this,
Yeah.
at the hearing
Yeah.
on that fab. Why isn't it being covered? Why aren't they shutting it down? That's the issue. Why aren't they shutting it down?
And I did get pretty good coverage at first on the retaliation stuff in 2021, but Apple put a lot of energy into stopping all of it. And there's been a dry spell other than like France and Germany magazine articles. I'm really big in France and Germany, but the U.S. not so much. So like it's shown me, especially with in 2021, I had like Financial Times articles, New York Times articles, Bloomberg, Reuters stuff. And it wasn't always, sometimes biased and had problems, but it was still coverage. It was still putting it out there. And then now there's just nothing. And yeah, we send press releases, and I'm trying to send the reporter stuff and, keep the communication. That NBC News, I check out, hey guys, there's more. You want to write more? Here's that video you did. And I was telling Steve, because I did like a screen capture when they played the nightly news. I was like, we need a copy, because if they back out, at least we have a copy of it on the TV and we can put it on YouTube. So we do. We have it on YouTube now. So they backed out, but we still have
And we can call them up when we have the hearing in San Jose.
Yeah,
Follow up.
he sends press releases. I send press releases like, hello. What about now? What about now? And it is really appalling that it is a local issue. There's a lot of local, like, where's Mercury News? Where's San Francisco Chronicle? We got San Francisco Chronicle and what was the other one? SF Gate did write about the EPA settlement. We haven't had them. They wrote some pretty good ones about the EPA settlement, the chip fab, but then like nothing else. And it does bother me of like, there's a lot of people that are exposed constantly at that site because it's huge apartments, there's city parks, there's playground, there's also a huge Whole Foods, there's restaurants, there's shopping gyms, doctor's offices, a lot of stuff. And then people driving and riding bicycles on that street that are also getting exposed like potentially every day. And most of those people probably have no idea. And so it seems like something that like, if Apple's not going to make people aware, the city's not going to make people aware, the government will settle this stuff, but still not make people aware they're being exposed. And then the news is not covering it.
Has there been any leafleting in the apartments and on the park?
We tried to
Yeah.
leaflet, and the strange thing is people did not want to take leaflets. It's like people in the neighborhood, Here you're in front of a fab, and people are walking by, ask them to take a flyer, they want to take a flyer.
It's weird.
So, I mean, these people won't even take a flyer about their own.
They're high-tech
their own,
workers.
you
They
know.
don't want to, yeah.
But I mean, it's like crazy, you know, take a flyer, read, if somebody's taking the time to hand you a flyer, take it and read, but the mentality is your own world silo, and just go ahead. But we have an opportunity with that hearing
Yeah, we
in
do.
San Jose to have a press conference and for people to speak out and reach the environmental movement, reach people in the South Bay. Hey, we gotta stop this fab poisoning people next to this factory.
It's also why I'm going so aggressive in the request for relief to shut it down. Of like, if no one's getting warned, they're still doing this stuff. It's still an active risk, and there's not even like mitigate. Like I gave all the defendants like months of time of like a menu of stuff they could volunteer to do to prevent me from filing this more aggressive motion. Mostly about like putting warnings, monitors, testing, something that could give people. They wouldn't do anything. They wouldn't compromise on a single item. They wouldn't even put up signs that say like it's a Fab or that it's Apple. Refused. And so I'm like, well, you're not compromising at all. I'm going to file my motion just asking to shut you down. And there's precedent of these cases when it is something really hazardous like this that can cause a substantial and imminent danger to the environment and community. The courts will at least temporarily shut it down until the operator and owner can prove they can operate safely, if they can prove it. And so that's what I'm asking for. So that's kind of like I'm out of options, apparently. If the agencies aren't going to do anything, the news isn't covering it, all this is going on, there's no one else to intervene, I'm going to appeal to this court the best I can. That's June 25th in the San Jose court, that it needs to be shut down. People could die within like minutes. We could have a mass casualty event. We could have a new Superfund site. That creek could be dumping a bunch of stuff into the Pacific Ocean right now, any minute. It needs to be shut down, and they should have to be relocated. I don't think they can prove they can do it safely because they're next to thousands of homes within like 300 feet. Children's Park within 300 feet. City parks. So and so that's why the city's there too. Where I was like, you approved this. You knew they're operating there doing this. You approve mass dense housing, and you have your own parks where you're inviting kids to come play, knowing it's next to a chip fab that doesn't have permits it needs, that's in violation of a bunch of stuff. It's not 2 consent agreements settling with agencies for its violations, both including a bunch of dumping into that air of hazardous chemicals. The city's like, not our problem. Like, I think it is.
And the mayor is financial conflicts.
There's
Lisa Gilmore?
Lisa Gilmore and her father actually approved the development that was filling a bunch of wetlands there, kicking out the farmers, because that was greenbelt, that was agriculture, that was actually world famous orchards, and farmer families, pioneers. Their families came in covered wagons from the Midwest, settled there, created pears and berries that actually were the Valley of Heart's Delight in this area. And it was her dad, who was a mayor in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and then Gilmore, who's been mayor off and on for like 2 decades too. They were the ones that kicked out I went back to the old newspaper articles, because I also, when I realized, we could do another thing about Saratoga Creek. When I realized that they illegally buried the ancient Saratoga Creek under all the industrial in that area, and it needs to be daylighted. If you guys are local, I don't know if you remember Saratoga Creek. It used to flow from the Santa Cruz Mountains all the way to the bay. And then in the 60s, they started burying it and merging it into San Tomas Creek. And they put in, that's the culvert I keep jumping into now to test to show it's so polluted. They merged them though, but the Saratoga Creek's really ancient, and it has the old artisan water. And it's about like 100 feet deep. It runs really, really deep. And it was the only waterway other than Guadalupe River flowing all the way from the mountains to the bay. And they kicked out, that was the irrigation for those orchards. That's what grew the Valley of Heart's Delight produce, is this amazing aquifer. And they wanted to build a bunch of industrial on top for the news articles, for the tax money. So they ended up just burying the creek into stormwater infrastructure and old farming irrigation pipes and hiding it underground. And I found where it's coming out to San Tomas. It's right under 101. I took pictures. It's in my complaint too. And they're like hiding it, that it's just an active creek, that they're trying to like pretend it's stormwater drainage. But I found it and I like pulled it open. It's like a flowing creek. They just hid under all this stuff. So I have a separate one. I kind of want to make them daylight that creek, like actually bring it back up. But that was the whole Gilmore family. That's been a multi-decade thing of like hiding that creek, kicking out all the farmers, and trying to build industrial in that area, which is wetlands. It's baylands. We could have another night about that if anyone wants to talk about that.
Next meeting here. Maybe what we can do is we can have a follow-up event after the press conference.
Deep dive on this stuff.
Want to learn more about what this is. We'll have a meeting here, because that would be
I'd
good
love to
have a
talk
meeting
about
here,
that.
yeah.
The more I've learned about the history here of the geology and the agriculture and
The movement's growing.
it's such an incredible area. The history here is so phenomenal. And the fact that we had some of the just internationally famous agriculture and such lush farmland, such cool rivers and streams, and they're alkaline too because it's going through the serpentine and all the really cool geology up in the mountains. And they had alkaline meadows. The San Francisco Estuary Institute has done really wonderful historical ecology research, looking back on the old documents and creating maps to show actually what this area naturally is like. And it's really, really cool. And it has very unique ecosystems you can't find hardly anywhere else, even in California. So I would love to talk about all of that more. I think it's something that when I sit down and talk to people about, everyone seems to get motivated and enthusiastic about it too, of how do we restore that? How do we bring it back to how wonderful it used to be? Step one is kicking out of Apple of that chip fab that's directly on top of the buried Saratoga Creek. I found the Saratoga Creek because I was trying to figure out where all the stormwater infrastructure was under their fab to find how they would get their pollution into it. Because that's my Clean Water Act claim. I need to show that it's going to the Pacific Ocean. So as I was trying to map it all out, I'm like, what is Saratoga Creek doing there? And then I'm like, what is all this weird stormwater infrastructure that seems to have a creek in it? And that led to a couple of months, and then a new citizen suit notice, and against Kaiser Aetna, and a bunch of other parties too. So that'd be another project later. If Apple settles and gives me enough money, I'm definitely going to try to daylight that creek. I want to bring it back. But I think that just shows how holistic and interconnected all this stuff is in this area too. And all this, the creek stuff, that's back to the industrial and these corporations and the chip fab. And not only did they fill wetlands and baylands. You don't fill wetlands. And they buried an ancient creek and they kicked out all the farmers. I found the articles. They were literally kicking them out. The farmers were trying to get a greenbelt protection on zoning because they wanted to stay. And it was Santa Clara and San Jose were fighting to kick them out so they could build it for industrial. It was really messed up. But all of that just goes to these same issues, same politics, same kind of cover-ups. So I would love to reignite a lot of the organizing that was happening in the 90s. There was a lot of stuff already built, and I think when people realize how cool this area actually is, when you get back to that history, and it doesn't just look like bland suburbs and tech companies, you get people with that local dedication and investment and wanting to take care of this area. And I know, I didn't grow up here, and I've only been back for a little bit of time, but after I learned about all this stuff, I'm like, I'm never leaving. This place is amazing, and I want to bring it back to the way it should be. And again, the first step is kicking Apple out of that fab.
On Tuesday, there's going to be a trial, Musk versus Elon.
Oh, yeah.
Musk,
Altman.
Altman, yeah. Maybe you can talk about that.
I don't know exactly I don't know about that chart. Steve invites me a lot to talk about Apple's reason for firing me being the AI stuff, which I'm always happy to talk about. We had a great panel with the San Francisco Library talking about AI and labor. And I feel like Apple gave me a strange gift that I can come and present and say Apple fired me for complaining about unethical data collection to develop their AI and says it's secret and I can't tell anyone, but here's what they were doing and that's just facially unlawful. It's the kind of stuff that FTC is taking action on, that lawsuits these companies are having to settle. They can't do that stuff that way. So Apple just openly saying it's secret and they'd fire an employee for telling anyone it goes back to what Steve said about them being criminals and should be in jail. So I try to talk about that when I have an opportunity. Steve, is there anything else you want to say about the trial?
I think, unfortunately, these techno-fascists are running the United States. Trump has put them in power.
Yeah.
And the Project 2025 is complete deregulation, which is what they're doing. They're destroying, they don't even want to have rules. And when Trump says piracy, we're the pirates. You ever heard that?
I wanted to ask a question. You mentioned early on about the Fab Center that they don't do it just for their own products, but rather people they have business deals with. Do you know if Apple has any? This isn't really related to what you've been talking about, and I apologize for that. But do you know if they have any ties to the military or anything like that?
I think there were some recent articles about them doing stuff with the Israel military, but I don't have any personal knowledge. I just say like maybe look it up online. I think they have had some ties they've been called out about.
I mean, Silicon Valley, this area is a center of military.
Of course, in
development.
general, but I was
That-
wondering about Apple
I mean,
specifically.
I'm sure they have contracts. I mean, their technology.
They'd say they're secret too, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's a secret thing. You know, but if people read that book, Palo Alto,
Oh, really good book.
people should read it. It's,
Yeah.
it's about 300 or 400 pages.
It's called Palo Alto is the title.
Palo
It's
Alto.
recent.
It's a very good book about the history of the valley.
And Margaret O'Mara's The Code. If you have not read that, I highly recommend that. That is about how before Silicon Valley, this was Defense Valley. And that was starting with generally Manhattan Project in the 40s and 50s in Stanford. And then rolling out with the microwave technology development, and there were military bases here. And most of the chip fab, especially the ones that created those Superphone sites, were Department of Defense projects. So Margaret O'Mara she's an academic writer, and she did an excellent
Valley.
history of Defense Valley and how it transitioned to Silicon Valley but never really changed. Because these silicon companies also, these tech companies, still do tons of work with the
And
government.
that's what is going massive amounts of money, the $1.5 trillion budget. They want to increase the military budget by 500 billion. That's going to go into more technology, more use of AI to track people and to kill people using AI.
Well, Trump says there's no such thing as corruption. What's wrong with corruption?
Well, and speaking of the local history too, I think looking back on this stuff is really important, both environmentally and politically and economically. But like you look back at the old pictures of Sunnyvale, you'll see Zeppelins flying over from Ames. Ames also had a bunch of the Operation Paperclip scientists from the war. They brought the Nazis over. They were over at Ames doing that work. That's also where propaganda operations were headquartered in Ames too. There's fascinating history when you start looking into this stuff, and then I think it helps you start pulling apart how these cities operate, the county operates, how the businesses have so much control over stuff, how we ended up with kind of the social and cultural situation we do in this area. It's a very strange area, and I never really liked it when I was here because it never really made sense to me. It felt like a very strange, just like suburban, paved over, no one really seems to live here, have personal attachment to the area. And I was in my tech bubble, but then, most of the area gets tech bubble because it's pushing everyone else out. The more I've learned about the history, it all makes sense now. And there was a reason a lot of it irritated me that I was seeing. It's like, it's artificial. It's not supposed to be there. It's displacing people that should be here in the natural environment. So all of this also has made me really dedicated to trying to help restore this area. And at least prevent further damage. Like watching them do this kind of stuff right now in Santa Clara that created all these issues that now we have decades or centuries to have to clean up. I at least want to prevent them from creating more of a mess. And that's one of the things I'm arguing to that judge, is what Apple is doing right now could create a new Superfund site. Santa Clara County already has the most Superfund sites, the federal oversight of the hazardous waste cleanups, of the whole nation, because of all the chip fabs. The 60s, 70s, 80s chip fabs. And I'm saying what Apple is doing right now could create a new one. We should not do that, And I'm hoping the judge, as this is intended, to have a local judge who feels a personal responsibility. That now, I'm not the only one sitting there saying, if I don't do something and there could be a mass casualty event with a gas leak, or a spill that creates a Superfund site, I could never live with myself. I have to do, but now that's on his plate too. And I feel kind of bad, but also not really, because that's his job, right? That was Congress's intent, is now that judge is saying, this is on my docket. And if I don't act on this, if I ignore this, if I delay and something horrible happens, now it's on his conscience too. And it's also interesting to think about that Congress had to design something like that as the worst case fail-safe for something so severe. Looking at what happened in the 70s and 80s, that's needed. Because that's how we had so many disasters.
Great. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.